The radiator ticks in the dark and the sound is almost kind. It is the middle of the night in a long brick building on the edge of a New England town, and the heat is coming up through old iron pipes the way it has come up every winter for 50 years. Somewhere down the corridor a door settles in its frame. Outside the snow has stopped falling, and the fields beyond the windows lie pale and unmoving under a sky the colour of slate. You're not a child in this building. You're only a quiet presence moving slowly through its rooms, the way memory moves through a place long after the people have gone. The floors are wood, worn smooth and dark in the centres, where countless small feet have crossed them. The walls are painted a green that was meant to be soothing and is only tired. The air smells of soap and steam, and the faint mineral scent of stone that never fully warms. In a dormitory near the end of the hall, rows of narrow iron beds stand in the half-light, each one made up with a grey wool blanket folded square. The boys who sleep here are sleeping now. Their breathing fills the room with a soft and even tide, rising and falling, and for these hours, at least, the building asks nothing of them. This is a real place. It had a name, and a long driveway lined with trees, and a superintendent who signed his letters in careful ink. It was called a school, though very little teaching happened inside it. Many of the children here had families somewhere, many had no one at all. And in the years just after a great war, men with degrees and good intentions and clipboards would come up that driveway and walk these halls, and they would offer some of these children something that looked, in the dim arithmetic of a hard life, very much like a gift. You already know that the gift was not what it seemed, but there is no need to hurry toward that knowledge tonight. For now, let the radiator tick. Let the snow hold its silence on the fields. Let the boys sleep in their narrow beds while the heat rises through the old pipes, and let yourself grow heavy and slow as you stand here in the warm dark, listening to a building breathe. To understand what happened in places like this, you have to let go of the way the present likes to picture the past. It is tempting to imagine that the cruelty in this story was loud and obvious, that it announced itself, that anyone walking past would have known. It was not like that. The cruelty in this story wore a clean white coat. It carried a fountain pen. It spoke gently to frightened children and called them by friendly names. And it believed, much of the time, that it was doing good. You find yourself, in these long hours before sleep, travelling through a stretch of the 20th century when faith in science had become something close to a religion. The war had ended. The men who built the bomb had become heroes. Penicillin was saving lives that would have been lost a decade earlier. Polio was being beaten back. Everywhere, in laboratories and lecture halls and the bright new wings of hospitals, there was a feeling that careful measurement and patient observation could solve almost any human problem, and that the people who did the measuring were among the most important people alive. That feeling was not wrong exactly. It gave the world antibiotics and vaccines and clean water and longer lives. But it carried inside it a quiet and dangerous idea. And the idea was this, that knowledge was worth almost any price, so long as someone else was the one who paid it. And the someone else, again and again, turned out to be the people who could not say no. The poor, the sick, the locked away. The children with no parents to ask awkward questions, no lawyers, no newspapers, no voice that the world had learned to hear. You will visit several of these places before the night's over, and you will meet at a gentle distance some of the children who lived in them. There is a home for orphans in a river town in Iowa, where a kind young woman will sit across a small table from a frightened girl and do something that should never have been done. There is a state school in Massachusetts, where boys are invited to join a club with an important-sounding name, and given watches, and taken to baseball games, and fed a special breakfast. There is a great institution on an island near a vast city, where children are deliberately given a disease so that the disease might be understood. In each of these places something was taken from children who had already been given very little. And in each of these places, when the work was done and the results were written up in careful prose and printed in respectable journals, the people responsible looked at what they had done and judged it a success. That word will return throughout this story, like a bell rung softly in another room. A success. The data were good. The findings were sound. The science, they would say for decades, was perfectly fine. It will be many years before the world disagrees. The records will sit in boxes in basements and libraries, gathering dust, neither hidden nor sought, until one cold December, a reporter opens a folder and begins to read. Only then will the children, now grown old, learn what was done to them when they were small. Only then will the soft bell of that word, success, begin to sound like something else entirely. But all of that lies ahead, far down the corridor of the night. There is no need to reach it quickly. The story will unfold at the pace of breathing, one quiet room at a time, and nothing in it will be made louder than it needs to be. You're safe, wherever you are listening from. The harm in this story is long finished. What remains is only the remembering, and remembering done gently can be a kind of rest. So settle deeper now. Let the weight of the day loosen its grip. We're going to walk slowly back through these buildings and these years, and we're going to look, without flinching and without hurry, at what was done in the name of progress to the children no one came for. We begin where so many of them began, behind the high windows of an institution built to hold the people that the world preferred not to see. If you find these quiet histories help carry you down into sleep, you can subscribe, and another one will be waiting for you the next time you need it. There is no need to do anything now, only listen. The story continues on its own. The buildings were almost always beautiful from a distance. That is one of the strange truths of this story, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. The institutions that held the unwanted children of America were not, as a rule, ugly. They were built in an age that believed architecture could heal, and so they were given long facades of warm brick and rows of tall windows and cupolas that caught the morning light. They were set on wide grounds with lawns and old trees and sometimes a pond, and a visitor arriving on a fine day might have thought, with relief, that the children inside were fortunate to live in such a place. You stand now at the foot of one such driveway, in the gentle imagination of this story, and you let your eyes travel up toward the main building. The gravel underfoot is pale and even. The air carries the green smell of cut grass, and beneath it, something institutional and faintly sweet. The smell of many meals cooked in great quantities in a kitchen that never quite closes. A flag hangs limp on its pole. The windows are many, and they are clean, and behind them the day is already long underway. These places had names that softened what they were: school, home, asylum in the older sense of the word, which once meant only a refuge, a sanctuary, a place of safety. Some were for orphans, children whose parents had died or vanished or simply could no longer feed them. Some were for children the law called feeble-minded, a term that swept up a great range of human beings, from those with real and profound disabilities to those who were merely poor, or slow to read, or born to a mother the state had decided was unfit. It is important, as you move through this story, to know how loosely that net was cast. Inside these walls were children who could not speak, and children who could speak perfectly well. There were children with genuine medical needs, and children whose only condition was that nobody wanted them. A boy might be sent here because he had no family, another because his family was too large or too hungry, or too troubled to keep him. A girl might arrive because she had been found wandering, or because a teacher had marked her difficult, or because a single test on a single bad morning had given a number that a clerk wrote down and that followed her for the rest of her childhood. Once inside, the differences between these children mattered very little to the daily machinery of the place. The institution had its rhythms, and the rhythms did not bend for the individual. There was a bell to wake by, and a bell to eat by, and a bell to work by, and a bell to sleep by. There were long tables and tin trays and food that was filling and plain. There were dormitories with rows of beds, and bathrooms with rows of sinks, and a laundry that ran with steam and the smell of bleach, and great kitchens where older children peeled mountains of potatoes under the eye of a tired attendant. The work was constant, and the children did most of it. This was not considered cruelty. It was considered training, an economy, and the natural order of an institution that the state funded poorly and expected to run cheaply. Children scrubbed the floors they walked on. They sewed the shoes they wore. They tended the gardens that fed them and stoked the boilers that warmed them. In some places they made the very brooms with which they swept the halls. A child who arrived at 6 might spend the next 10 years learning very little from books and a great deal about labour. You move now through one of the long corridors, and the sound of your passage is swallowed by the size of the place. The ceilings are high. The light falls in slanting columns from the tall windows and lies in bright bars across the floor. There is a smell of floor wax and old radiators. Far off you can hear the murmur of a great many young voices, the sound a building makes when it is full of children who have learned to be quiet, a low and constant hum that is never quite silence and never quite speech. The attendants who ran these wards were not, for the most part, monsters. They were ordinary people, often poorly paid and badly overworked, sometimes kind and sometimes not, charged with the impossible task of managing dozens of children at once, with almost no help. Some were gentle, some were exhausted into hardness, a few were genuinely cruel, and in the closed world of the institution, where no parent watched and no inspector came often, cruelty could go unpunished for years. The children learned quickly which adults to trust and which to avoid, and they learned to fold their hands and lower their eyes and make themselves small. For a child inside these walls, the great fact of life was its sameness. One day was very like the next. The seasons turned outside the windows, the snow came and melted, and the leaves opened and fell, but inside the bells rang at the same hours, and the trays held the same food, and the beds stood in the same rows. Time did not so much pass as accumulate. A childhood spent in such a place was not a story with chapters. It was a long, grey, even corridor, and the child walked down it from one end to the other, growing taller, learning the rules, waiting for something that rarely came. And what they waited for, more than anything, was to be chosen, to be visited, to be remembered by someone on the outside. The deepest hunger in these places was not for food, though there was often too little of that. It was the hunger to matter to someone, to be singled out, to have a hand reach into the grey sameness and rest on your shoulder and say, in effect, you. You are the one I have come for. You are special. That hunger is the most important thing to understand about every child in this story, because it is precisely that hunger that the men with the clipboards would learn to use. Consider what it would mean to a child who had been overlooked his whole short life, to be told that he had been selected, chosen for a club, picked out from the crowd for something important, promised gifts and outings and a special breakfast and the attention of educated men who had driven a long way just to see him. To a child in a place like this, that was not a small thing. It was close to a miracle. It was the answer to the only prayer that mattered. You pause now at a window at the end of the corridor and look out over the grounds. The lawn runs down to a line of trees. A few figures are crossing it, small in the distance, a column of children being walked from one building to another. They move in a loose grey line, and the late sun is warm on the grass, and from here, at this distance, it could almost be a school like any other, on an ordinary afternoon, with nothing wrong at all. That is how it looked from a distance. That is how it was meant to look. And it is from exactly this distance, the comfortable distance of the well-meaning observer, that so much of what happened in these places was permitted to happen. No one had to be a villain. Everyone could tell themselves a gentle story. The buildings were beautiful, the children were fed, the science was important, and the people who paid the price had no way to make themselves heard. It helps to understand how a child arrived in such a place, because the paths were many, and almost all of them began in misfortune rather than in any failing of the child. A father might die in an accident at the mill, and a mother, left with more mouths than wages, might surrender one or two of her children to the state simply so that the rest might eat. A family might come apart under the weight of illness or drink or poverty, and the children, scattered, might wash up at the gates of an institution because there was nowhere else for them to go. A child might be born to an unmarried woman in a time that punished such women cruelly, and be given up before he could remember a face. The institution was the place where all these private catastrophes ended up, gathered under one roof, sorted and numbered and filed. And once filed, the child became, in a sense, the property of the file. A single assessment, a single number from a single test administered on a single morning by a stranger, could determine the entire shape of a life. There was a faith in those years in the measurement of minds, in tests that promised to reduce the vast mystery of a child to a number that could be written in a box. The tests were crude and biased, and often administered to frightened children who had every reason to perform badly, and yet the numbers they produced were treated as facts about the soul, permanent and portable, following the child from ward to ward and year to year. You can walk the length of one of these institutions and feel how thoroughly the place was built to manage rather than to raise. The dormitories are long because long rooms hold more beds. The corridors are wide because wide corridors move children efficiently from one supervised space to another. The windows are high, sometimes, so that the children cannot easily see out or be seen. Everything about the architecture, for all its handsome brick, speaks of control and economy, of the housing of many on the resources of few. The buildings were beautiful from a distance and functional up close, and the function was containment. There were thousands of such places, large and small, across the country, and they held, altogether, a vast population of the nation's discarded children. Most of them have been forgotten now, their buildings repurposed or demolished, their records scattered or lost. But for the better part of a century they were a fixed feature of the landscape, as ordinary as a courthouse or a church, and the society that built them did not, on the whole, think of them as cruel. They were simply where such children went. They were the solution to a problem the society did not wish to think about more deeply than it had to. And inside them, the founder's old dream still flickered here and there, in a kind teacher, an attendant who slipped a child an extra word of comfort, a moment of grace in the grey routine. Not everyone who worked in these places was hard. Some genuinely cared, and did what little the system allowed them to do, and were remembered with love by the children they were kind to. But the system itself was indifferent, and the kind ones worked against its grain, and there were never enough of them. And the grain of the system always, in the end, won. The dream that had built the first of these schools, the dream of lifting children up, survived only in fragments, in individuals, against the weight of an institution that had long since forgotten it. Come back for a moment to the gate, and to what it meant to a child to pass through it for the first time. A new child arrived by car or by the arm of a tired adult, often without warning and without explanation, set down at the foot of that long handsome drive with whatever small bundle of belongings the world had left him. The building rose ahead, large and unfamiliar, its many windows giving nothing away. And behind him, the gate, and beyond the gate, the road back to whatever had been home, narrowing and vanishing as he was led up the drive and inside into the smell of soap and steam and stone, into the rules he did not yet know, into the long, grey corridor of years. The seasons turned over these places with a particular indifference. In autumn the old trees on the grounds dropped their leaves across the lawns, and the children raked them, and the air grew sharp, and the radiators began their nightly ticking. In winter the snow lay deep and clean over the fields, beautiful and cold, and the windows frosted at their edges, and the building drew in on itself against the dark. In spring the grounds greened, and the children were let out more often, and in the long heavy heat of summer the dormitories grew close and airless, and sleep came slowly. The weather was the one great variety in lives otherwise built of sameness, and the children watched it the way prisoners watch the sky. To the people of the surrounding towns the institution was simply part of the landscape, a known quantity, neither questioned nor much thought about. They drove past its gates on their way to other places. They knew vaguely that it held children of a certain kind, the orphaned, the abandoned, the ones the world called slow, and they were glad, mostly, that such a place existed to take them, so that they themselves did not have to. The institution performed a service for the comfortable, which was to make the inconvenient invisible, to gather the children no one wanted into one place behind handsome brick where no one had to see them, and for performing this service it was left, by and large, alone. And being left alone is precisely the condition in which the wrongs of this story could grow. A place that no one watches is a place where anything can happen, where the only check on the treatment of children is the conscience of whatever adults happened to be in the room. Where those adults were kind, the children were treated kindly. Where they were not, there was no one to appeal to, no inspector likely to arrive, no parent to telephone, no newspaper to call. The isolation that made these places convenient for the society outside made them dangerous for the children inside, and it made them, in time, irresistible to the men who came looking for subjects who could be used without anyone watching or asking why. So hold the image of the gate and the long drive and the handsome building full of windows that gave nothing away, and the towns going about their business beyond the walls. This was the world the children lived in, beautiful from a distance and hard up close, watched by no one, forgotten by almost everyone, a world built to keep certain children out of sight. It was into this world, already sealed and silent, that the men with the clipboards would come, finding everything arranged for their convenience, the subjects gathered, the watchers absent, the gate closing softly behind them as they walked up the drive in the morning light. Hold that image for a moment as the light begins to lengthen and gold. The grey line of children crossing the grass, the beautiful brick building, the clean windows with the long afternoon behind them. Let it soften and blur at the edges, the way a scene does when you are very tired and very warm. We will go inside one of these buildings now, into the daily life of one particular school, and we will meet the boys who lived there before the men in the white coats ever arrived. Let the story narrow now from the many buildings to a single one. Off a road called Trapelo, in the town of Waltham, Massachusetts, on a property of nearly 200 acres, there stood an institution that had been founded in the middle of the 19th century by a reformer who genuinely wished to help. Its first purpose had been hopeful, even tender, in the language of its time. It was meant to teach children whom the world had written off as untrainable, to show that they could learn, that they could grow, that they could lead useful and dignified lives. The man who later gave the school his name became for a while a model that visitors came from across the world to study. But good intentions are not the same as good outcomes, and the decades did not treat the place gently. Over time its mission curdled. The hopeful idea of teaching the so-called untrainable gave way to a colder idea, born of the eugenics movement, that such children were not to be taught at all but simply contained, kept apart from the rest of society, prevented from growing up to have children of their own. The school that had been built to lift children up slowly became a warehouse to keep them out of sight. You stand now inside its walls, in the years after the Second Great War, and you feel at once how far the reality has drifted from the founder's dream. The wards are crowded, the staff are too few, the children sleep in long rows, dozens to a room, and an attendant charged with watching 3 dozen of them at once keeps order in the only way one tired person can keep order over so many, which is through rigid routine and the constant threat of punishment. In one ward, the rule is that the children sit on wooden benches with their arms folded, and that they do not unfold them. A boy who later grew old and told the story remembered that if you unfolded your arms, you were struck. So the children sat, hour upon hour, small hands tucked away, learning the great institutional lesson, which is that the body must be still, and the self must be quiet, and that obedience is the price of being left alone. Many of the children here were not, in any meaningful sense, disabled at all. This is one of the quiet scandals beneath the louder one. By the count of those who later studied the place, a large share of its residents were of ordinary intelligence, sent here not because of any true condition, but because they were poor, or orphaned, or born into families that had broken apart. A boy might be labelled with a word that meant nothing about his mind and everything about his circumstances, and once the label was written in the file, it was almost impossible to remove. The file followed the child. The file became the child. The education they received was education in name only. A man who later wrote a book about these boys described how a child might pass through the first year of school again and again and again, reading the same simple primer year after year, the same few characters and the same few words, his progress not so much neglected as actively prevented. There was little expectation that these children would ever leave, and so there was little reason, in the cold logic of the institution, to prepare them for a world they were not meant to rejoin. And yet they were children, and children remain children even in the bleakest of places. They formed friendships, they invented games, they found in one another the family the institution had not given them. In the dormitories after the lights went out, there were whispered conversations and small kindnesses, and the slow building of the loyalties that would decades later bring these men back together to demand the truth. The human spirit is stubborn. It puts down roots in the thinnest soil. Even here, in this hard place, the children found ways to remain themselves. You move through the dining hall now, a great echoing room with long tables and a high ceiling, where the clatter of tin trays bounces off the walls and the smell of boiled food hangs heavy in the warm air. The boys file in and sit and eat quickly, the way children eat when food has ever been scarce, when there is no certainty that more will come, when the meal is one of the few clear pleasures in a day made of waiting. They are watched as they eat. There is always someone watching. The food itself was filling and dull, the food of an institution feeding many on little. Porridge in the mornings often, bread, stews that stretched a small amount of meat across a great number of bowls, For a hungry child, more of it was always welcome, and the promise of more, of a special and larger portion, of a quart of fresh milk all to yourself was a promise with real weight. Remember that, as the story goes on. Remember how much an extra helping could mean to a boy who had learned never to expect enough. The grounds outside offered the only real escape. On fine days the children might be let out to the lawns and the gardens, to work mostly, but also in the margins to run and shout and be briefly free. Beyond the trees lay the town, and beyond the town lay the city, and beyond the city lay the whole wide world that these children could see in the distance and almost never enter. To leave the grounds, even for an afternoon, even on an errand, was an event to be remembered for weeks. The boundary of the institution was the boundary of the known world. So imagine now what it would mean to be offered a way across that boundary. To be told that you, in particular, had been chosen for something special, and that this something would include trips, real trips, off the grounds and into the city, to a stadium where men played baseball under the open sky before a roaring crowd. Imagine being a boy who had spent his whole life inside these brick walls, watching the world through clean, tall windows, and being told that the world was now, at last, going to let you in. You would not ask many questions. You would put your hand up, you would say, "Yes, me, choose me, I want to go." This is the soil in which the experiments grew, not in a dungeon, not in a place of obvious horror. In a tired and crowded school, run cheaply by overworked people, full of children who had been overlooked their whole lives, and who hungered, above all else, to be chosen. The men who came up the driveway with their clipboards did not have to force anyone. They only had to offer what these children wanted most, and let the children's own hope do the rest. The day at the school began before light, with a bell, and the bell was the first of the many small authorities that governed every hour. There was a way to rise and a way to wash and a way to dress, and a child learned these ways quickly, or learned the consequences of not learning them. The washroom was a row of sinks and a quantity of cold water, and the boys moved through it in a line, and there was no privacy anywhere in the building, not in the washroom and not in the dormitory and not in the long echoing toilets, because privacy was a luxury the institution did not provide and did not see the need for. To grow up in such a place was to grow up always watched and never alone. Breakfast was porridge most mornings, ladled out in quantity, plain and grey and warm, and the boys ate it fast because hunger taught them to, and because the bell would soon ring for the next thing. The food was the food of an institution feeding hundreds on a budget set by men who never tasted it, and it was monotonous in a way that is hard to convey. The same dull meals turning over week after week, so that years later a man might remember the exact texture of that porridge, the exact weight of it in the stomach, the way you remember the few fixed things in a childhood that offered little else to hold on to. Then came the work, for the institution ran on the labour of its children. There were floors to be scrubbed and laundry to be folded and vegetables to be peeled and grounds to be tended, and the children did all of it, supervised by attendants, in long shifts that left little time for anything resembling school. The labour was justified as training, as the building of useful habits, but its real function was economy. A school that makes its own children do its work is a cheap school to run, and cheapness was the governing virtue of the place. The boys grew strong in their hands and starved in their minds, and the state that paid for them counted the arrangement a sound one. Punishment was constant and casual, woven into the texture of the day. There were the official punishments, the withholding of the small privileges, the confinement, the labour assigned as penalty. And there were the unofficial ones, the slap, the shove, the harder thing done by an attendant who had reached the end of a long shift and a short temper, in a closed world where no one was watching, and no child would be believed. The children learned the geography of danger, which adults to avoid and which corners and which hours, and they passed this knowledge among themselves, a folklore of survival whispered after the lights went out. But you must not imagine the children as merely crushed, because they were not. They were children, and children find ways to be children even here. They made games of nothing, of a ball, of a chase across the grounds, of a story told in the dark. They formed fierce loyalties, brother to unrelated brother. The family the institution had failed to provide assembled instead from one another. They had their jokes and their nicknames and their small rebellions, their hidden caches of contraband, their secret kindnesses. The human spirit, even here, even in these children who had been given so little, insisted on being itself, and that insistence is its own kind of testimony, and it is worth honouring before the rest of the story comes. The evenings at the school had their own slow shape, after the work was done and the last meal eaten. There was a stretch of time before sleep when the boys were gathered in the wards, and the light outside drained away, and the great building settled toward night. Some boys played quiet games. Some sat and did nothing, which is its own occupation in a place that offers little else, and then the bell, and the washing, and the long rows of beds, and the lights going down, and the particular sound of a dormitory full of children breathing in the dark, dozens of them, the soft collective tide of it filling the high cold room. Winter nights were the hardest and, in a strange way, the most bearable, because winter gave the radiators a purpose, and the radiators gave the room a sound. A boy lying awake could listen to the heat ticking and knocking its way up through the old iron pipes, a sound almost like company, almost like something alive keeping watch in the dark. The wool blanket was thin, but it was warm enough if you lay still, and the boy beside you was warm, and in the deep middle of the night, with the building quiet and the snow on the fields and the radiator ticking, there was a kind of peace available even here, a peace stolen from the edges of a hard life, real for being stolen. The friendships forged in those wards were the deepest the boys would ever know, and it is important to dwell on them, because they are the thread that runs all the way to the end of the story. With no families to belong to, the boys belonged to one another. They shared what little they had, food smuggled from the kitchen, knowledge of which adults to fear, the warmth of a body in the next bed on a cold night. They invented their own loyalties and their own justice, their own code of who could be trusted. And these bonds, formed in childhood under hard conditions, proved astonishingly durable enough that decades later, when the truth came out, the grown boys could find one another and stand together, because they had never entirely stopped being a kind of family. There were small mercies too woven into the grey, and an honest account must include them. A particular attendant who was gentle, a cook who slipped extra bread to a hungry child, a window that looked out on something worth looking at, a stretch of sky, a line of trees, the changing weather. A boy who was good at something, at running, or at making the others laugh, and who found in that small excellence a way to be someone. The institution was hard, but it was not, every hour of every day, unrelieved misery, because children will not allow it to be, because the human spirit reaches for light the way a plant reaches for it, finding the gaps, growing toward whatever warmth it can find. It is in this texture, the hard routine shot through with stolen warmth and fierce friendship, that the boys were living when the announcement came about the club. They were not broken creatures waiting to be rescued. They were children making a life, as children do, out of the materials they were given, and the materials were poor and they made a life anyway. And that is part of what was betrayed when the men arrived with their watches and their promises. Not the betrayal of broken things, but the betrayal of resilient ones, of children who had managed, against the odds, to keep hoping, and whose hope was precisely the thing that was about to be used. Rest there a while in the warm and ordinary cruelty of that dining hall, with the clatter of trays slowly fading and the boys finishing their meal, and the long afternoon waiting beyond the windows. Nothing terrible has happened yet. The men have not yet arrived. The boys are only eating, and being watched, and waiting, as they wait for everything, for the next bell, the next day, the next small chance that something might happen to single them out. We will turn now to the men who were, at that very moment, in laboratories not far away, beginning to plan exactly how that hope could be put to use. If you're drifting already, there is no need to fight it. Let yourself go down into the quiet. Subscribe if you would like another of these stories waiting for you when you wake, and then let the thought go entirely. Sleep is the only thing being asked of you now. The story will keep on, soft and slow, whether you follow it all the way or let it carry you under. The men who came to these places were not by and large wicked men. It would be easier in some ways if they had been. A clear villain is a comfort. He can be condemned and set apart, and the rest of us can feel certain that we are nothing like him. But the people who conducted these experiments were, for the most part, respected professionals, well educated and well regarded, who went home in the evening to families of their own, and believed themselves to be servants of human progress. That is the harder truth, and it is the one worth understanding. Picture the kind of man this story turns on. He has a degree from a fine university, perhaps several, He works in a laboratory or a clinic, surrounded by the instruments of his trade, the scales and the test tubes and the careful notebooks ruled into neat columns. He believes sincerely in the power of knowledge to relieve human suffering. He has perhaps lost someone to a disease and dreams of conquering it. He reads the journals, attends the conferences, knows the names of the great figures in his field, and hopes, one day, to have his own name spoken among them. He lives in a moment when his profession has never stood higher. The war has just ended, and science has won it. Science split the atom and ended the fighting. Science is curing the diseases that emptied the cradles of every previous generation. Across the country, money is pouring into research as never before, from the government, from foundations, from companies eager to put the stamp of the laboratory on their products. To be a scientist in these years is to ride a great rising wave of confidence and prestige. The future belongs to people like him, and he knows it. And inside that confidence, almost invisible, sits the dangerous idea. It is the idea that the pursuit of knowledge is so important, so unambiguously good, that the ordinary rules might bend around it, that a small harm to a few might be justified by a great benefit to the many. That consent, that troublesome business of asking permission and explaining risks, is a courtesy owed to people who can understand and refuse, and therefore not really owed to people who cannot. The idea is rarely spoken aloud in these stark terms. It does not need to be. It lives in the assumptions, in the things that go without saying, in the quiet certainty that the work is too important to be slowed by sentiment. You must understand that there were, at this time, almost no rules to stop him. The great codes of research ethics that we take for granted today did not yet exist, or existed only on paper, far away, ignored. After the war, the doctors who had performed monstrous experiments in the camps of Europe were put on trial, and out of that trial came a set of principles written down about consent and voluntariness and the welfare of the subject. But those principles were understood in America to be about them, about the enemy, about the kind of men who could never be confused with a respectable professor at a respectable institution. They were not understood to be about us. They were not understood to be about a friendly nutritionist offering a boy a bowl of oatmeal. So the researcher operates in a world without breaks. No committee reviews his plans. No independent body weighs the risks against the benefits. No one insists that the subjects understand what is being done to them, or that they be free to refuse without losing anything, or that they be told the truth at all. He answers, in practice, only to himself and to his peers, and his peers are all doing more or less the same thing, and they all agree that it is fine. The absence of a rule is mistaken for the presence of permission. And then there is the question of where to find his subjects. Here the logic is cold and in its way perfectly rational, which is what makes it so chilling. A good experiment, he knows, requires control. You cannot simply hand people a substance and hope they take it correctly. You need to know that every subject ate exactly what you gave them, at exactly the right time, and nothing else. You need to collect samples reliably, over weeks or months. You need subjects who will not wander off, who will not refuse halfway through, who will not be whisked away by a worried parent. You need, in short, a captive population. And the institutions were full of captive populations. This is the cruel arithmetic that drew these men to the orphanages and the state schools. Not malice, in most cases, but convenience. The children there were available. They were controllable. They could be counted on to be in the same place tomorrow and the day after. They had no parents standing guard, or parents too poor and too cowed to object, or guardians who were the state itself, the very body that funded the research. A scientist later asked, in plain words, why he had not used students from the university instead of children from the institution, gave an answer that explained everything. You cannot, he said, simply let your subjects walk around. You have to control them. You have to be sure they eat properly and that you can collect everything. Unless you do it that way, you will not have a good experiment. Sit with the flatness of that reasoning for a moment, because its flatness is the point. There is no cruelty in his voice when he says it. There is no awareness that he is describing the use of children as instruments. He is talking about experimental design, about rigor, about doing the work in the best possible way. The children have become, in his mind, not people with the same claim on dignity as his own children, but variables to be held constant, a controlled environment, a reliable supply. The horror is not in any single sentence. The horror is in the absence of horror, the perfect calm with which a human being is reduced to a usable thing. And he would have told you, if you had asked, that he meant the children no harm. Often he believed the doses were too small to matter, the procedures too minor to count, the discomfort too brief to weigh against the knowledge gained. Sometimes he was even right about the physical effects, and we will come to that, because it complicates the story in ways that deserve honesty. But the deeper wrong was never only about the physical dose. The deeper wrong was the decision, made coolly and in advance, that these particular children did not need to be asked, did not need to be told, did not need to be treated as ends in themselves. That decision was made before any oatmeal was ever served, before any frightened girl was ever seated at any small table. It was made in the quiet of the laboratory, in the assumptions a confident man did not even notice he was making. You leave the laboratory now, with its neat notebooks and its good lighting and its faint smell of chemicals, and you carry that understanding with you into the rest of the story. The men who did these things were not unlike the people we pass on the street or see in the mirror. They were clever and confident and sure they were on the side of progress, and that sureness was precisely the thing that let them do harm and call it good. Remember the friendly young woman you have not yet met in the orphanage by the river. She too will believe she is doing important work. She too will be following instructions from a man she admires, and she will spend the rest of her long life unable to open the letters those children sent her. Consider the laboratory itself, the world this man inhabited, because it shaped how he saw everything else. It was a place of order in a disorderly century. On its benches, the chaos of nature was tamed into measurement, weighed and titrated and recorded in columns. There was a deep satisfaction in this work, the satisfaction of the clean result, the experiment that came out, the number that confirmed the prediction. A scientist learns to love that clean result, to organize his days around the pursuit of it, and the love is not ignoble. It has given the world much of what is good in it. But a love of the clean result can quietly become a willingness to do whatever the clean result requires, and the requirement in this kind of work was control, and control meant people who could not say no. The journals he read were full of confidence. Every issue brought news of some new frontier crossed, some old enemy of human life pushed back. The men who filled those pages were his models and his judges, the audience whose respect he most desired, and they had all more or less made the same accommodation he was making. They too went to the institutions. They too found their subjects among the captive and the poor. It was simply how the work was done, an open secret that required no defending because no one in the relevant circle thought it needed defending. To rise in that world was to absorb its assumptions, and its deepest assumption, never stated, was that the advancement of knowledge sat higher on the scale of goods than the dignity of a powerless child. It would be wrong to paint him as cold, because often he was not. He could be warm with his colleagues, devoted to his own children, generous with his students. The capacity to compartmentalize is one of the strangest features of the human mind. The ability to be tender in one room and instrumental in the next. To cherish your own son at the breakfast table, and, an hour later, to regard an institutionalized boy as a controlled variable, without ever feeling the contradiction. The men in this story were not missing the part of the soul that loves children. They had simply drawn a line, invisible even to themselves, around which children counted, and the institutional children fell outside it, and outside it the ordinary tenderness did not reach. The era gave him every encouragement to draw that line. The same decades that produced the great medical advances also produced a hard and confident philosophy about human worth, a belief that some people were of more value than others, that the strong and the capable mattered more than the weak and the dependent, that a society might reasonably sort its members and invest accordingly. This philosophy had built the very institutions in which he found his subjects. It had decided, before he ever arrived, that these children were surplus, a burden, a problem of management rather than a treasury of persons. He did not invent that judgment. He inherited it, and he made use of it, and his use of it felt to him simply like realism, like seeing the world as it was. And so he proceeded, as thousands like him proceeded in good conscience and good standing, a respected man doing respected work, untroubled by the thing that troubles us now. The tragedy of him is not that he was a monster, but that he was not. A monster we could dismiss. He cannot be dismissed because he is too much like the competent, well-meaning, confident people of every age, including our own, who do harm not in spite of their virtues but by way of them, who are led into cruelty not by malice but by certainty, and who would be genuinely astonished to the end of their days to hear themselves described as anything other than good. Picture the ordinary morning of one of these men, because the ordinariness is the whole point. He wakes in a comfortable house, in a pleasant suburb, and he breakfasts with his own children, and he is, by every domestic measure, a good father. He kisses them goodbye. He drives out along roads he knows well, his briefcase on the seat beside him, perhaps thinking about the day's work, the samples to be collected, the measurements to be taken, the small problems of method that occupy a careful mind. There is nothing in his morning to mark him as a man on his way to do harm. He is a professional going to work, and his work happens to be located in a place full of children who cannot refuse him. He arrives, and he is welcomed. The superintendent receives him cordially, for a visit from a distinguished researcher reflects well on the institution, lends it a borrowed prestige, ties it to the great world of science and the great universities. They speak as colleagues, over coffee perhaps, two reasonable men arranging a reasonable thing. The access is granted easily, because there is no reason on either side to make it difficult. The children are discussed the way one discusses any resource, in terms of numbers and suitability and logistics, and not once in the cordial conversation does the question arise that should arise, the question of whether these particular children, who cannot understand and cannot refuse, ought to be used in this way at all. The work itself, when it is done, is meticulous and calm. He's good at his job. He measures carefully, records faithfully, controls his variables, follows his protocol. There is a real craft in it, and he takes a craftsman's satisfaction in doing it well. The children pass through his study as subjects pass through any study, sorted and dosed and sampled, and he is not unkind to them in the doing of it, may even be pleasant, may smile and speak gently, because there is no need to be harsh, and harshness would only complicate the work. The cruelty of the enterprise does not live in his manner, which is mild. It lives in the frame, in the prior decision that these children were available, a decision so settled that it never surfaces as a decision at all. And at the end of the day he drives home again, back along the known roads, back to the pleasant house and the children who are his to protect. He does not feel that he has done anything wrong, because by the standards he applies he has not. He has done good science carefully in service of knowledge, using subjects that everyone in his world agrees are appropriate to use. He will have dinner with his family and read, and sleep soundly, and rise the next day to do it again. The distance between the two sets of children, his own and the institution's, the protected and the usable, is so total and so invisible to him that he crosses it twice a day without ever feeling the border. This is the face of it that we least want to look at, because it is the most familiar. Not the leering villain, but the competent professional, the good father, the careful craftsman, going to work in the morning and coming home at night, doing harm in between without ever once feeling like a man who does harm. If there is a single image to carry away from all of this, let it be that one, the man on the known road, briefcase beside him, thinking about method, on his way to children who cannot say no, untroubled, ordinary, sure that he is one of the good ones. He was sure of it to the end. That sureness is the most dangerous thing in the story, and it is the thing that lives, in some form, in all of us. For now, let the thought settle and grow soft. The dangerous idea, dressed in a clean white coat, moving up a tree-lined drive on an ordinary morning, meaning no harm and doing a great deal of it. We will follow one of these men, or rather his young assistant, to a particular orphanage, in a particular town, in the late winter of 1939, and we will sit quietly in the corner of a small room while a kind voice begins to do a cruel thing. Travel west now in the easy way that the mind travels when the body is still, across the wide middle of the country to the state of Iowa, and to a town on the banks of the Mississippi called Davenport. The year is 1939. The Depression has worn the country thin. Along the great river the barges move slowly, and the spring comes late and grey, and on the edge of the town stands a home for the orphaned children of soldiers, a long institutional building with its own grounds and its own routines and its own population of children who belong, in the eyes of the law, to no one but the state. It was called the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans' Home, and it held children whose fathers had died or whose families had collapsed, children with no one to claim them and nowhere else to go. Like the school in Massachusetts, it ran on routine and on the labour of the children themselves, and like that school, it was a closed world, with its own weather of mood and rule, where an adult's attention was a currency more precious than any other. The children here had learned the same lessons that institutional children everywhere learned. Be quiet, be useful, do not hope for too much, and above all, if someone should ever single you out for kindness, hold on to it with both hands, because it may not come again. The story that unfolded here began far away in the mind of a man at the University of Iowa, and it is worth understanding him because his motives were not cruel. His name was Wendell Johnson, and he was, by the late 1930s, one of the most respected figures in the young science of speech pathology in the entire country. He was warm, by the accounts of those who knew him, and charismatic and generous with his time. People wrote to him from all over the world seeking his advice, and he carried, his whole life, a private wound that drove everything he did. Wendell Johnson stuttered. He had stuttered since childhood, severely, and he had suffered for it, in the way that children who are different always suffer, mocked and singled out and made to feel that something was broken in him that could not be fixed. He had grown up believing, as the science of his day believed, that stuttering was inborn, a flaw written into the body, a thing you simply were, and he had spent his adult life refusing to accept that verdict, searching for another explanation, one that might mean the affliction could be undone. The theory he came to was, in its way, a hopeful one, and this is the bitter irony at the heart of what followed. Johnson came to believe that stuttering was not born but made, that children were not born stutterers but turned into them by the anxious attention of the adults around them. A child speaks, as all small children do, with the ordinary stumbles and repetitions of someone just learning the enormous machine of language. And then, Johnson thought, a worried parent or teacher pounces on those ordinary stumbles, names them, frets over them, corrects them, until the child becomes painfully aware of his own speech, and that very awareness tightens his throat and traps the words, and the stutter that was only feared becomes a stutter that is real. If this were true, the implications were profound and kind. It would mean that no child was doomed by his birth. It would mean that stuttering could be prevented simply by leaving children alone, by not labelling them, by not making them self-conscious. It would mean that the affliction that had shadowed Johnson's whole life was, at bottom, a wound inflicted by anxious love, and that future children might be spared it entirely. You can feel, in the theory itself, the longing of the man who made it, the wish to believe that what hurt him was not destiny but accident, and that accidents can be avoided. But a theory, to become science, must be tested, and here the kindness ran into the wall of method. To prove that negative attention could create a stutter, one would have to take children who did not stutter and subject them to negative attention and see whether the stutter appeared. To prove that the wound could be inflicted, in other words, one would have to inflict it. There is no gentle way around this. The experiment that the theory demanded was, at its core, an attempt to damage healthy children in order to confirm how the damage worked. A more cautious mind might have stopped there, might have seen that the only honest test of the theory was a test that could not honestly be performed. But Johnson did not perform it himself. He handed the task to a graduate student, a young woman named Mary Tudor, who would do the actual work, sit in the actual room, speak the actual words to the actual children. This is a pattern you will see again and again in this story. The man who conceives the experiment is rarely the one who carries it out. The distance between the idea and the act is filled by an assistant, often young, often female, often acting out of admiration and obedience, and the wish to please a teacher she respects. The harm is delegated downward, and the conscience, such as it is diffused across the gap. And where would Mary Tudor find healthy children whom no one would protect? Children she could subject to months of relentless negative attention, without any parent objecting, without any guardian asking what she was doing, or why? You already know the answer. She would find them where men like these always found them. She would drive out to the edge of Davenport, to the long building by the river, to the home full of the orphaned children of soldiers, where the state stood in the place of the missing parents and the state had given its blessing, and where the children, hungry as all institutional children are hungry for an adult's kind attention, would be all too ready to love a pretty young woman who came and sat with them and seemed, at first, to care. So the pieces are in place now, and they fit together with a terrible neatness. A respected scientist with a hopeful theory and a private wound. A theory that can only be tested by harming the healthy. A young assistant willing to do as she is told, and a building full of children who belong to no one, who can be used without anyone's permission, and who will mistake the experiment for the very thing they have wanted all their lives, which is to be chosen, to be visited, to matter to someone from the world outside. The home by the river had its own particular weather, the weather of all such places made of routine and longing. The children there rose to a bell and ate at long tables, and did their share of the work, and they watched the river move past the town, the great brown Mississippi carrying its barges south toward places they would never see. The river was freedom, in a way, the one thing in sight that was always going somewhere, and a child standing at a window might watch it for a long time, imagining the towns downstream, the wide world that flowed past the orphanage every day and never stopped to take anyone with it. Wendell Johnson, far away in his university office, was by every account a man worth admiring in most respects, and this matters because it would be easier if he were not. He had turned his own suffering into a life of helping others who suffered as he had. He answered the letters of strangers, parents desperate about a stuttering child, with patience and real care. He was beloved by his students. The Institute would bear his name not as a cover for shame, but as a genuine tribute to a genuine contribution. All of this is true, and all of it sits alongside the other truth, that he conceived an experiment that required the deliberate attempt to damage healthy orphans, and handed it to a young woman to carry out, and was pleased by her reports as the damage seemed to take. The diagnosogenic idea that drove him, the idea that stuttering was learned rather than born, was not foolish. Elements of it survive in the understanding of speech to this day, woven into more careful and more humane theories. The instinct that the way we treat a child shapes the child was a real and valuable instinct. The horror lay not in the idea, but in the method the idea seemed to demand. The conviction that to prove how a wound is made, one must make the wound. A wiser conscience would have recognized that some hypotheses cannot be tested on human beings without becoming crimes, and that the proper response to such a hypothesis is not to find a population on whom the crime can be committed quietly, but to leave the hypothesis untested or to find another way. That Johnson did not himself sit in the room is part of the pattern, and part of the evasion. The distance between the man who designs the harm and the young woman who delivers it is a distance across which responsibility leaks away. He could tell himself he was doing science, theory, design, the clean work of the mind, while the unclean work of actually frightening a child happened elsewhere, performed by someone else, reported back to him as data. And she could tell herself she was only following instructions, only doing the assignment, only being the obedient student of a man she revered. Between the two of them, the full weight of the act fell on neither, dispersed into the gap, and the children were harmed by a wrong that no single adult had to feel themselves fully committing. The orphanage cooperated, as institutions cooperated, because a request from a distinguished professor at the State University was not the kind of request such a place refused. The children were available. The arrangement was easy. No one with the power to object had any reason to. And so the machinery assembled itself almost without friction, each part sliding into place, the theory and the assistant and the captive children and the cooperative institution, all of it humming quietly toward the small plain room where the work would be done, while the river slid past outside the windows carrying its barges south, indifferent and free. The home by the river kept the same hours as every such place, the bell before dawn, the work, the meals at the long tables, the bell at night. But it had its own particular character, as institutions do, shaped by the river beside it and the children within it. Many of the children there had known a parent once, had a memory of a father lost to war or accident, a mother who could not keep them, and this gave their longing a specific edge. They were not children who had never been loved. They were children who had been loved and then lost it, which is its own kind of wound, and which left them especially hungry for any adult who might love them again. Into this hunger, in the late winter of that year, came the news that a young woman from the university would be coming to work with some of the children to help them with their speech. To be selected for her attention was, at once, a mark of being singled out, and the children who were chosen felt the old institutional thrill of having been picked. They did not know what they had been picked for. They knew only that a pretty visitor from the outside world was going to spend time with them, just them, and that this set them apart, and that being set apart in a place built on grey sameness was the thing they wanted most. You can imagine the anticipation of a child waiting to be called down to the small room. The waiting itself would have been sweet, a thing to look forward to in a life with little to look forward to. She was kind, the visitor. She smiled. She gave her attention fully, in a way the overworked staff never could, and to a starved child, full attention from a gentle adult is a kind of feast. The child went down to the small room hopeful, even happy, walking toward what felt like the best thing that had happened in a long time, and the cruelty waiting in that room was made worse, immeasurably worse, by the brightness of the hope that carried the child toward it. This is the geometry that recurs throughout the whole story, and it is sharpest here, in the room by the river. The harm did not come disguised as harm. It came disguised as the very thing the child most wanted. The orphan who longed for a mother was given a gentle young woman who seemed, at first, as if she might fill that aching place. The longing was real, and its object was real, and the betrayal was that the object had been sent to do the opposite of love, to plant in the child with all the tools of warmth and attention, a shame that would last a lifetime. To be hurt by a stranger is one thing. To be hurt by the gentle adult you had begun to hope might save you is a wound that reaches the deepest places, and it was that wound, precisely, that the experiment was designed to inflict. So let the orphanage stand quiet by its river in the late winter light, the barges sliding past, the children at their long tables, and among them the chosen few, waiting with shy excitement to be called down to the kind young woman in the small plain room. They are happy, in this moment before it begins. They have been chosen. Someone has come for them at last. Hold them there, in their last hour of unspoiled hope, before the gentle voice across the small table begins, week by week, to teach them to be afraid of their own speech. They did not know. They only knew they had been picked, and that it felt, after everything, like being loved. Let the river move slowly past the town in the grey spring light. Let the orphanage stand quiet on its grounds, its windows lit one by one as the evening comes on. Inside, the children are at their supper, and among them are 22 who do not yet know that they have been selected, who are still only children waiting, as they always wait, for something to happen. Tomorrow, or the day after, a young woman will arrive with a kind face and a notebook, and she will begin. We will be there, quietly in the corner of the room when she does. The room they used was small and plain, the kind of room every institution keeps for purposes it does not advertise. A table, 2 chairs, a window with the late winter light coming through it, thin and pale. On the table, a notebook and a pencil, and the patient apparatus of a study. And into this room, one child at a time, the children came, sent down from their wards, told only that a nice young lady wished to talk with them, curious and a little nervous, and beneath everything quietly thrilled to have been chosen for something, anything, that set them apart from the others. Mary Tudor was young, and by the children's accounts she was kind-seeming, even lovely, the sort of grown-up that a lonely child might fasten onto with sudden and total devotion. One of the girls in the study years later remembered hoping, in the secret way of children who have no mother, that this pretty visitor might somehow become her own. That detail tells you everything about the gap between what the children felt and what was being done. The child sat down at the small table hoping to be loved. The young woman across from her had been sent to do something else. There were 22 children in the study, and Tudor and Johnson sorted them into groups. Some would receive what they called positive therapy, gentle encouragement, praise for their speech, reassurance that they spoke well, and some, a particular group, would receive the opposite. These children, who spoke perfectly normally, who had no stutter and no trouble at all, would be told steadily and repeatedly over the coming months that there was something wrong with their speech, that they were beginning to stutter, that they must try harder, watch themselves, catch every hesitation, stop before the trouble took hold. The whole purpose was to take fluent children and, through nothing but words and attention, attempt to break their fluency. Understand what this asked of the children and why it was so insidious. A child speaks without thinking, the way she breathes, the way she runs. To speak is simply to be, and now a kind adult. An adult she wants to please, an adult whose approval has become the brightest thing in her grey week, is leaning toward her across a small table and telling her, gently, with concern in her voice, that her speech is failing, that she is starting to stutter, that she must be careful now, very careful, with every word. So the child begins to listen to herself. She begins to monitor the thing that was never meant to be monitored. Each time she opens her mouth, the warning sounds in her head. Watch out, here it comes. Do not stumble. And of course, the more fiercely she watches for the stumble, the more likely the stumble becomes, because speech, like sleep, like so many of the body's easy gifts, falls apart the moment you try too hard to control it. The very anxiety the experiment created was the thing meant to produce the result. The sessions went on through the spring and into the month that followed. Tudor would arrive and the chosen children would be brought to her, and she would tell them, with all the warmth that made it so effective, that their speech was getting worse, that the adults had noticed, that they really must do something about it. She instructed the staff at the home to reinforce it, to correct these children, to point out their hesitations, to treat them as children with a developing problem. The label was applied not for an hour, but as a steady pressure, week after week, from the adults who controlled every part of the children's lives. And the children changed. Not all in the same way, but they changed. Some grew quiet. A child who had spoken freely began to speak less, and then hardly at all, because the safest way to avoid the stumble you have been taught to dread is simply to stop speaking. Teachers noticed that certain children had become withdrawn, reluctant, that they covered their mouths when they spoke, that they avoided answering in class. One bright girl, who had arrived fluent, began to deteriorate, her confidence draining out of her week by week. She had wanted the young woman to be her mother. Instead, the young woman had taught her to be afraid of her own voice. It is worth pausing here to be honest about the science, because the truth is more complicated than the simplest telling, and this story deserves the complicated truth. The experiment did not, in the end, turn fluent children into lifelong stutterers in the clinical sense. When researchers concluded the work, they found that they had not, by their measures, produced true chronic stuttering in children who had never had it. In that narrow technical sense, the theory was not cleanly proven, and the children did not all leave with the specific disorder the study had set out to create. But to stop there would be a lie of a different kind, the kind of lie the researchers themselves would later lean on. Because while the experiment may not have manufactured clinical stutterers, it did harm the children, deeply and lastingly, in ways the study was not designed to measure and did not care to record. It took ordinary, healthy children and taught them shame. It made them self-conscious about the most basic act of being human. It withdrew them, frightened them, marked them, in some cases for the rest of their lives. The girl who grew withdrawn carried it for decades. Others spoke, when they were old, of self-doubt that never left them, of a wound to their confidence that had been opened in that small plain room and never fully closed. That is the thing to hold on to as the light fades in that room by the river. The defenders of this work would one day say that it failed, that no real stutters were produced, as though failure were the same as innocence. But the cruelty was never in the success or failure of the hypothesis. The cruelty was in the attempt. It was in the decision to sit across a table from a trusting child and spend months teaching her to fear her own speech, in the hope that the fear would take root and prove a point. Whether the experiment worked is a question for the journals. Whether it was wrong is not a difficult question at all. Mary Tudor knew it. That is perhaps the saddest thread in the whole account. By the testimony she gave much later, she did not like what she was doing even as she did it. She felt the wrongness of it in the room, but she was young, and she had been given an assignment by a man she admired, and in that time, in that place, one did what one was told. She finished the work, she wrote it up, and for the rest of her long life, when letters came from those children, grown now, she sometimes could not bring herself to open them, and when she did, the words would not come to her, and she would sit there shaking, an old woman undone by a thing she'd done as a girl because someone told her to. The method depended entirely on the trust of the children, and that's what makes it so hard to sit with. A stranger who frightens a child achieves only fear, and fear can be resisted, walled off, disbelieved. but a kind and admired adult who tells a child gently that something is wrong with her achieves something far deeper. The child believes it, because she wants to believe everything the kind adult says, because the kind adult is the brightest thing in her week, because to doubt the kind adult would be to lose the one warm relationship she has. The warmth was not incidental to the harm. The warmth was the instrument of it. The more the children loved Mary Tudor, the more thoroughly her words could reshape how they heard themselves speak. Picture one of the chosen children in the weeks after the sessions began. She has been told by someone she trusts that her speech is starting to fail. So now, at meals, in the dormitory, in the schoolroom, a part of her stands apart and listens to her own voice, waiting for the stumble she has been warned about. The listening itself is the trap. Speech that is watched too closely begins to falter, the way a foot watched too closely begins to stumble on a stair that was never a problem before. Each small hesitation, once it would have passed unnoticed, now blazes up as proof of the thing she has been taught to dread, and the dread tightens the throat, and the tightened throat produces more hesitation, and the spiral turns slowly, downward, week by week. Some children resisted the spiral better than others, and this too is part of the honest picture. Not every child in the negative group was equally harmed. Temperament and circumstance made some more vulnerable and some more resilient. But the ones who were vulnerable were harmed in ways that reached far past the duration of the study. A child taught to be ashamed of her own voice does not simply recover when the sessions end. The shame has been planted in the soil of the self, and it grows there, and it sends up its bitter shoots for years, in the avoidance of speaking, in the lowered confidence, in the sense, never quite shaken, that there is something wrong with her that others can hear. The records and recollections that survive paint a consistent picture of children who grew quieter, more withdrawn, more self-conscious over the months of the study. Teachers and staff noted the changes. A girl who had been ordinary and fluent became halting and shy. The experiment that was meant to prove how stuttering is made did not cleanly manufacture clinical stutterers, but it did manufacture suffering, reliably, in child after child, and the suffering was the entirely foreseeable result of doing exactly what the experiment set out to do, which was to make healthy children believe their speech was failing. That Mary Tudor came to be haunted by it tells us that the wrongness was visible from inside the room, that it did not require the hindsight of a later and more careful age to be seen. She felt it as she did it. She did it anyway because she was young and obedient, and the authority above her had told her it was sound, and that is its own quiet lesson, about how much harm can be done by good people who decline, in the moment, to trust the thing their conscience is telling them. The shaking hands of the old woman, decades later, unable to open the letters from the grown children, are the body's long memory of a wrong the mind had tried to file away as an assignment. The conscience kept the account even when the will refused to read it. It is worth lingering gently on what speech is to a child, because only then does the full weight of the experiment become clear. A small child does not think about speaking any more than she thinks about walking. The words simply come, carrying her thoughts out into the world, connecting her to the people around her. Speech is not a skill she performs, but a part of who she is, as natural as breath, as unconsidered as the beating of her heart. To speak is, for a child, simply to be present, to reach out, to exist among others. It is one of the most basic and most innocent of all human acts. Now imagine the innocence deliberately poisoned. Imagine a trusted adult leaning close and telling the child with concern that this natural thing, this breath, this reaching out, is going wrong, that she must watch it now, that she must catch it, control it, fear it. The experiment took the most unself-conscious act a child possesses and made it self-conscious, took something the child had never had to think about and forced her to think about it constantly, anxiously, with dread. It turned the child against her own voice, set a part of her to watching and judging another part, divided her against herself at the very root of her connection to the world. And a child cannot easily undo such a thing, because a child has no perspective from which to see that she is being deceived. An adult told that his speech is failing might doubt the diagnosis, seek a second opinion, consider the motives of the one delivering it. A child has none of these defences. The kind adult is an authority, perhaps the only gentle authority in her life, and what the kind adult says about her is simply true, the way the weather is true. If the kind young woman says her speech is going wrong, then her speech is going wrong, and the only question is how to stop it, and the harder she tries to stop it, the worse it becomes. She's trapped inside a false belief she has no means to question, planted there by someone she trusts. The withdrawal that followed in some of the children was the soul's attempt to protect itself in the only way available. If speaking has become dangerous, frightening, a source of shame, then the child speaks less. She grows quiet. She covers her mouth. She avoids the situations that demand speech, the classroom, the conversation, the moment of being called on. The withdrawal is not the disorder the experiment sought to create. It is something sadder and more general, a child folding inward, making herself smaller, retreating from the world because the world has become, at the level of her own voice, a place of danger. And a child who learns to retreat at 6 or 8 or 10 may go on retreating for the rest of her life. That is what was risked and in some children realized in that small plain room. Not a clinical diagnosis, which the study failed to produce, but something the study was not even trying to measure and produced in abundance. The quiet damage to a child's relationship with her own voice and her own worth. The men would later point to the failed diagnosis as if it were exoneration. But the orphan girl who ran away, who never told her husband, who said at the end that it had ruined her life, was not talking about a clinical category. She was talking about what it does to a person to be taught, in childhood, by someone she trusted, to be ashamed of the sound of her own self. That damage did not need a name in a journal to be real. She carried it for 60 years, which is the only measure that finally matters. Let that room grow dark now and release it. The small table, the thin window light, the trusting child and the troubled young woman on either side of it. The harm done there was quiet, almost gentle in its method, which is exactly what made it so terrible. There were no instruments, no needles, no doses. There were only words, kind in their tone and cruel in their purpose, spoken to children who had nothing in the world but the hope that an adult might, at last, be on their side. We will leave them now and carry the memory of them eastward again, to the boys in Massachusetts, and to a club with a fine and important name. The Stone in the Riverbed. What happened to the study by the river, after the sessions ended and the children went back to their wards, is its own quiet lesson. It was not trumpeted. It was not published in the proud journals of the field. Mary Tudor wrote it up as a thesis, a document submitted for a degree, and then it was set aside, and the men who knew of its existence at the university spoke of it, when they spoke of it at all, with a nervous half-joke. Among themselves they called it the monster study. They knew what it had been, and they let it sink like a stone dropped into the river beneath the surface of the respectable record. There is a detail here that is almost too neat to be true, and yet it is true. The man whose theory the study had served, the warm and respected scientist who had wished above all to understand the affliction that shadowed his own life, went on to a long and honoured career. The university's Institute for the Study of Speech and Hearing came, in time, to carry his name. For decades, students walked beneath that name on their way to learn how to heal the very disorder that had been deliberately provoked in healthy orphans to make his point. The honour stood in plain sight, the harm stood in the dark behind it, and almost no one connected the two. This is how these things vanish, not always through some dramatic cover-up, some locked vault, some shredding of evidence in the night. More often they vanish through ordinary forgetting, through the simple fact that the people harmed had no power, and the people who did the harming had reputations to keep and careers to build. A thesis goes into a drawer, a box goes onto a shelf. The children grow up and scatter and carry their private wounds, without ever knowing what was done to them or why. The world moves on, busy with its progress, and the quiet stone settles deeper into the riverbed every year. And it is crucial to understand that the study by the river was not a freak, not the work of a single bad man in a single bad moment. It was one expression of a way of thinking that ran broad and deep through the science of its era. All across the country, in these same years and the years that followed, researchers were turning to the same captive populations for the same reasons, and telling themselves the same reassuring stories about the importance of the work. The orphanage in Iowa was not the exception. It was the rule, made briefly visible. Consider how natural it all seemed at the time. If you needed to test a vaccine, where would you test it but on children who were gathered together in one place? Easy to monitor, easy to track. If you needed to study a disease, where would you study it but in an institution where the disease already spread freely through crowded wards? If you needed subjects who would not refuse, who would not wander, who would do as they were told and be there for the follow-up, the institutions offered them by the hundred. The same features that made these places miserable to live in, the crowding, the control, the absence of anyone to advocate for the child, made them ideal, in the cold eye of research, as laboratories. And the children in them were, in the unspoken hierarchy of the age, considered to be of less account. This is the part that is hardest to say plainly, and the most necessary. A society that locks certain children away because they are poor, or orphaned, or labelled defective, has already decided that those children matter less. The experiments did not create that judgment. They followed from it. Once you have built a system that treats a group of children as lesser, as surplus, as a problem to be contained rather than persons to be raised, the step to treating them as material for research is not a leap at all. It is barely a step. It is the same idea, walking a little further down the same road. You can feel, moving through this story, how the institution and the experiment fit together like a hand and a glove. The institution gathered the powerless and stripped them of advocates. The experiment arrived to make use of exactly that powerlessness. The superintendent who signed the letters and the professor who designed the studies were often on friendly terms, colleagues in a shared project, and the consent that mattered in the end was not the consent of any child or any parent, but the consent of the institution itself, which was only too glad to cooperate with the prestigious men from the university. The fox was not breaking into the hen house. The fox had been invited in and given a key and thanked for his interest. So when we turn now to the boys in Massachusetts, do not think of their story as a separate scandal, unrelated to the children by the river. Think of it as the same story, told again in different key, different state, different decade, different substance on the spoon, but the same underlying machine, the same captive children hungry to be chosen, the same confident men sure of the importance of their work, the same quiet decision made in advance and never spoken aloud that these particular children did not need to be told the truth, and at the end of it all the same soft bell of that word success, rung over a thing that should never have been done. It would be comforting to believe that the people of that time simply did not know any better, that the ethics we hold now were unknown then, that everyone was doing their honest best by the lights they had. There is a sliver of truth in this. The formal rules really were absent, but the deeper knowledge was not. The men who ran these studies would never have done such things to their own children, or to the children of their colleagues, or to any child whose parents could pick up a telephone and call a lawyer. They knew, at some level they preferred not to examine, that what made these particular children usable was precisely their helplessness. And a thing you would only do to the helpless is a thing you already know to be wrong. There is a particular way that institutions protect themselves, and it is worth naming, because it is gentler and more effective than any conspiracy. An institution does not, as a rule, need to lie or destroy or scheme to bury an inconvenient truth. It needs only to do nothing, to let the ordinary processes of filing and forgetting carry the truth quietly out of view. A thesis is shelved. A study is not publicized. The few who know are senior people with reputations bound up in the institution's good name, and they do not raise the matter, not out of villainy, but out of the simple human reluctance to disturb a settled thing that reflects badly on one's own house. Silence requires no orders. It is the default, and the default is enough. And the pattern those silences protected was genuinely national in scale. This is the part that resists belief, and that the careful records nonetheless confirm. The use of institutionalized and orphaned children as research subjects was not a regional aberration, or the work of a few notorious figures. It ran through the mainstream of mid-century science, in respected universities and hospitals across the country, funded by reputable bodies, published in reputable journals. Vaccines were tested on the children of institutions, diseases were studied in their wards. Nutritional questions like the one about the cereals were answered using their captive bodies. The institutional child was, for a stretch of decades, simply an available resource, drawn upon as a matter of course by people who would have been baffled to be called criminals. What made this possible was not a shortage of conscience in any one person, but a structure that diffused conscience until it disappeared, The superintendent who allowed the access could tell himself he was advancing science and bringing benefits to his school. The researcher who designed the study could tell himself the institution had given permission. The funding body could tell itself the research was sound and the local arrangement someone else's concern. The journal that published the results could tell itself it was simply reporting findings. At no point in this chain did any single person have to confront the whole act and own it. Each handled only his piece, and his piece, taken alone, looked clean, and the dirtiness lived only in the assembly of the pieces which no one was responsible for assembling. The captive nature of the subjects was the silent foundation of all of it, and it bears repeating because everything else rests on it. A free person can be informed and can refuse, and the requirement to inform and the possibility of refusal are precisely what protect the free from being used. The institutional child could not be meaningfully informed, because no one with the power to explain had any incentive to, and could not meaningfully refuse, because refusal would have meant defying the very adults who controlled his food, his bed, his every privilege and punishment. Strip away information and the power to refuse, and you have stripped away the whole defense of the person, and what remains is a body that can be used, and the institutions had produced such bodies by the thousand. So the studies were not interruptions in an otherwise humane enterprise. They were the natural fruit of a system that had already reduced certain children to instruments before any scientist arrived. To see this clearly is not to excuse the scientists, who made their own choices and bear their own share. It is to refuse the comfort of thinking that the harm was exceptional, a few bad actors against a decent backdrop. The backdrop was not decent. The backdrop was the thing that made the actors possible, and the actors in turn made the backdrop pay. Cage and experiment, institution and study, were two expressions of a single idea about which children mattered, and the idea was wrong at the root, and everything that grew from it was poisoned at the root as well. The honoured name above the institute door deserves one more look, because it captures the whole strange morality of how these things are remembered. The name was placed there in sincerity, to honour a man who had, in most of his work, genuinely helped people, who had eased real suffering, who had advanced his field. The honour was not a lie, and yet it stood above a building dedicated to healing the very disorder that had been deliberately provoked in healthy orphans to serve the honoured man's theory. Both things were true at once, the genuine contribution and the buried wrong, and the world chose, as the world usually chooses, to see only the first and to let the second sink quietly out of view. This is how reputations are built and protected, not through deception so much as through selective attention. A man's contributions are gathered into the light, and his wrongs are allowed to settle into the dark, and the gathering and the settling happen almost on their own, by the ordinary gravity of how institutions remember. The contributions are useful to remember, they reflect well, they can be celebrated, named after, taught. The wrongs are useful to forget. They reflect badly, they complicate the celebration, and so, without anyone quite deciding it, the record arranges itself into a flattering shape, and the flattering shape becomes the official memory, and the official memory is what gets carved above the door. The same selective gravity operated across the whole landscape of these experiments. The papers that reported the useful findings were published and cited and built upon, entering the permanent record of science, while the human cost of obtaining those findings appeared nowhere in the papers because the papers had no column for it. A study would report in clean and confident prose what had been learned about iron or calcium or the course of a disease, and it would not report that the subjects had been deceived, that they could not refuse, that they had been chosen for their powerlessness. The cost was simply not part of what a scientific paper recorded, and so, in the official memory of the field, the cost did not exist. The knowledge survived, the wrong evaporated. It took a deliberate effort, decades later, to reverse this gravity, to drag the buried wrongs back up into the light and set them beside the celebrated contributions, to insist that the official memory was incomplete, that the flattering shape had been achieved by leaving things out. This is what the reporters and the investigators and the survivors eventually did, and it was hard work, work against the grain of how institutions prefer to remember, and it succeeded only partly and only late. But it succeeded enough to change the shape of the record, to ensure that these names now carry, alongside their genuine honours, the memory of what was done, so that the celebration can no longer be quite so simple, and the children can no longer be quite so completely forgotten. That is, in the end, what remembering a wrong actually means, and why it is worth doing even when it's too late to help the wronged. It means refusing the flattering shape. It means insisting that the record include the cost. It means setting the buried thing back beside the celebrated thing and holding them together, the contribution and the harm, the honour and the wrong, and declining the comfortable forgetting that would let us keep only the half that reflects well. The stone that was dropped into the riverbed has been lifted at last and held up to the light, and seen for what it was. It cannot be dropped back. That lifting, performed too late for the children, is nonetheless the one form of justice that remains permanently available to the living, the justice of refusing to forget. Let that settle now, slowly, the way silt settles in still water. The study by the river, sunk and forgotten, the honoured name above the door, the children scattered and unknowing. And beneath it all, the broad, dark current of an age that had decided some children were worth less than others, and had built the buildings and written the rules and lined up the spoons accordingly. We will follow that current eastward and forward, back to the long brick school off Trapello Road, to a spring morning when an announcement is made to a ward full of boys, and a hand goes up, and another, every one of them hoping to be picked. The announcement, when it came, must have sounded like the best news a boy at the school had ever heard. There was to be a club, a science club no less, with that fine and serious word attached to it, science, the word that belonged to the men who had won the war and split the atom and were curing the diseases of the world. And the boys of the school, or some of them, the brighter ones, the favoured ones, were going to be invited to join. To a child who had been told his whole life that he was feeble, that he was defective, that he was the kind of person who was not supposed to amount to anything, the very name of the thing was a balm, a science club, for him. You can picture the moment in the ward, the attendant reading out the news, the ripple that went through the rows of boys. To be chosen for this was to be lifted suddenly out of the grey crowd. It meant you were special. It meant educated men from a great institution across the city had looked at the roster of nobody's children and picked you. And membership came with rewards so dazzling, to a child who had almost nothing, that they barely seemed real. Extra food, a whole quart of milk to yourself, parties, gifts, and the prize above all prizes, trips off the grounds, real outings, into the city, to the ballpark, to see the great game played under the open sky. Remember the boundary of the institution, the wall at the edge of the known world. The science club promised to carry these boys across it. They would ride out through the gates that had always closed behind them, out past the trees and into the noise and colour of the city, and they would sit in the stands at a real baseball game, among ordinary people cheering free for an afternoon, indistinguishable from any other boy in America. For a child of the school, this was not a perk. It was a transformation. It was the thing he had dreamed of in the dark of the dormitory, the hand reaching in to single him out and say, "You, come with me, you are wanted." One of the boys, who grew into an old man and told the story late in his life, said it as plainly as it can be said. Any chance to escape that place, he remembered, was so irresistible that if the men had offered him an outing in exchange for swallowing poison, his hand would have shot straight up. "I want it," he would have cried. "Choose me. We are going to a ball game." He was not exaggerating to make a point. He was describing exactly the calculation of a child who's been given so little that he will trade almost anything for an afternoon of feeling like a person. The men who designed the club understood that calculation perfectly. It was, in a sense, the whole mechanism of the thing. And so the boys were enrolled, and the favoured ones received their Mickey Mouse watches, those small bright treasures strapped to thin wrists. The first thing some of them had ever owned that was truly their own. They were given the watches, and the milk, and the promises of trips, and they were told that they were now part of something important, that they were helping with vital work, work for the good of all mankind. They were told they mattered, and they believed it, because they wanted so badly for it to be true, and because no one had ever told them anything like it before. What were they actually being asked to do in return for all this wonder? Nothing, it seemed, that could possibly be bad. They were to eat a special breakfast. That was the heart of it. A bowl of oatmeal, warm and filling, more than they usually got, and a glass of milk, and from time to time they would give a little blood, a sample drawn from the arm so that the scientists could study how growing boys took in the goodness of their food. It was framed as a kindness, even a privilege. They were being fed better than the other boys, they were being looked after by doctors, they were special. What could be the harm in a bowl of oatmeal? There was, of course, harm in it, or at least there was wrong in it, hidden in the oatmeal like the thing it actually contained. But hold that for a little while, because it matters to feel first how it looked from the boy's side of the table. From where he sat, there was no menace at all. There was a warm breakfast and a kind doctor and the promise of a baseball game, and a feeling, new and intoxicating, of having been chosen. The trap, if we must call it that, was baited with exactly the things the child most wanted, and it was baited that way on purpose, by men who had thought carefully about what would make these particular boys say yes. The letter that went to the families where families existed completed the gentle deception. It came from the superintendent of the school, a man of authority and standing, and it described the study in warm and reassuring terms. The boys, it explained, were being given a special diet and extra privileges. They would get a quart of milk a day. They would be taken to a ball game and to the beach and to dinners. They would enjoy it greatly. The letter asked, in effect, that the family raise no objection, and it noted that if no objection were raised, the boys' participation would simply be assumed. The study, it suggested, would help improve the nutrition of the children and help them generally, more efficiently than before. Read that letter with the knowledge the families did not have, and its careful softness becomes something colder. It did not say what was really in the breakfast. It did not say the word that mattered. It spoke of nutrition and milk and ball games and improvement, and it left out the single fact that would have changed everything. The fact that the special oatmeal and the special milk carried, mixed invisibly into them, traces of radioactive material, placed there so the scientists could follow the path of the food through the children's bodies. The families were told a true thing about milk and a false thing by omission about what the milk contained, and on the strength of that letter, with its warm tone and its missing word, the studies went ahead. The genius of the science club, if a thing so troubling can be called that, was that it did not feel like coercion to anyone involved. No one was dragged. No one was forced. The boys competed to be included, longed to be included, counted themselves lucky to be included. Coercion that announces itself can be resisted and resented. But an offer that gives a deprived child exactly what he most desires does not feel like coercion at all. It feels like fortune, like being seen at last, like the answer to a prayer. And a child who feels fortunate does not look for the catch, because looking for the catch would spoil the only good thing that has ever happened to him. Think about what the perks meant against the backdrop of that life. A quart of milk, all your own, in a place where food was scarce and shared and never quite enough. A watch on your wrist, a real possession when you had owned nothing. A trip beyond the gates into the wide forbidden world, when the boundary of the grounds had been the boundary of your life. These were not small bribes to a child of the school. They were enormous, life-altering, the stuff of dreams, and they were offered freely with smiles by men who seemed to like him. To weigh such gifts against an invisible risk he had not been told about and could not have understood was not a calculation the boy was equipped to make. The scale was loaded before he ever stepped onto it. And there was the deeper hunger underneath the milk and the watch, the hunger the gifts only stood for. To be in the club was to be chosen, and to be chosen was to be told for the first time that you were not surplus, not defective, not a mistake the world was sorry to have made. The men had looked at the long roster of nobody's children and pointed at you. They wanted you. They thought you were bright enough, special enough, worth bringing into something important. For a child who had absorbed every day of his life the message that he was the kind of person who did not matter, that pointing finger was a kind of salvation, and he would have followed it almost anywhere. The men understood this. That is the hardest part. The seduction was not accidental. The club was designed deliberately to be irresistible to exactly these children, to exploit exactly this hunger. Educated men sat down and considered how to secure the cooperation of institutionalized boys, and they arrived at the answer that the boys' own longing supplied. Give them what they crave, the attention and the treats and the feeling of being special, and they will line up, and their guardians, told a warm and partial story, will not object, and the whole apparatus of consent will be satisfied on paper, while being hollowed out in fact. The boys' deepest wound, their hunger to be wanted, was studied and turned into the lever that moved them. So when the chosen boys sat down to their special breakfast, proud and grateful, watches on their wrists, heads full of the promised ball game, they were experiencing something genuinely sweet and something secretly false at the very same moment, and they had no way to separate the two. The sweetness was real, the attention was real, the milk and the watch and the trips were real, and folded invisibly inside all that reality was the deception, the thing not said, the use being made of them under cover of the gifts. They tasted only the sweetness. The rest waited silent in the warm bowl and the careful notebooks to be tasted 40 years later on a winter morning with the radio on. The trips beyond the gates deserve their own remembering, because they were, for the boys, the brightest thing the club provided, and because their brightness is inseparable from the wrong. A boy who had spent his whole life inside the grounds was loaded into a vehicle and carried out through the gates that had always closed behind him, out along roads he had never travelled, into the noise and colour and crowds of the city. To a child of the institution, this was very nearly overwhelming. The sheer abundance of the world, the people, the buildings, the sense of being. For a few hours, an ordinary boy among ordinary boys, indistinguishable, free. And then the ballpark, the great green field opening up below the stands, the crowd roaring, the players small and bright in the distance, the whole vast public spectacle of it. A boy who had owned nothing and gone nowhere sat in that crowd and was, for the length of a game, exactly like every other boy in America, cheering the same plays, eating the same food, free in the same sun. It is hard to overstate what this meant to a child who had been told his whole life that he was defective, surplus, the kind of person who does not get to do such things. For a few hours he got to. For a few hours the club made him a boy like any other, and he loved it with his whole heart, and he was grateful, and his gratitude was the point. Because every one of those bright hours was also a transaction, though the boy did not know it. The trips were not gifts freely given out of kindness. They were inducements, carefully chosen rewards, the consideration offered in exchange for his cooperation in a study he had not been told the truth about. The men had calculated correctly that outings like these would secure what they needed, would make the boys eager and compliant and unquestioning, would buy their participation more effectively than any explanation ever could. The joy was real, and the joy was bought, and the boy, tasting only the joy, could not see the purchase folded inside it. He thought he was being treated, he was being paid. This is what makes the memory of those trips so painful in retrospect once the truth is known. The boys carried them for decades as their happiest childhood memories, the day at the ballpark, the watch on the wrist, the feeling of being chosen and special and free. And then, on a winter morning 40 years later, the meaning of those memories was turned inside out. The happiest day became evidence. The treat became the bribe. The feeling of being chosen became the recognition of having been selected, targeted, used. Nothing about the memory changed, and everything about it changed, because the boy finally understood what the joy had been the payment for. And yet, even knowing all of this, one hesitates to take the joy away from the boy entirely, to reduce those bright hours to nothing but a transaction, because that would be to let the men win twice. The joy was also, simply, joy. The boy at the ballpark really was happy, really was free for those hours, really did taste something good in a life that offered little of it. The men's cynicism does not have the power to reach back and poison the actual experience of the actual child, who knew nothing of their calculations and felt only the sun and the crowd and the green field. Let the boy have the day, then, the real day, the happy one. The wrong was in the men who bought it. The joy was the boy's own, and it was real, and it remains his, whatever it was meant to purchase. So the club was formed, and the watches were given, and the trips were promised, and the boys, lucky boys, chosen boys, sat down each morning to their special breakfast with the bright, unguarded joy of children who believe at last that the world has noticed them and meant it kindly. Let them have that moment in the warm light of the dining hall before we follow the spoon any further. Let them be for now only happy. The men in the white coats are pleased. The data are beginning to come in, and the boys are eating their oatmeal and planning in excited whispers what they will do when they finally pass through the gates and into the wide green afternoon of the waiting world. We are halfway through the long night of this story now, and if your eyes have grown heavy, let them close. There is nothing more you need to do. If you would like another quiet history waiting for you tomorrow, you can subscribe before you drift, and then set the thought down and let it go. The voice will continue on its own, low and unhurried, asking nothing of you but that you rest. What was in the bowl? To understand why there was radioactive material in a bowl of children's oatmeal, you have to step back from the school for a moment and into the ordinary commercial world of the late 1940s, into the bright and busy business of selling breakfast. It is a strange truth of this story that its roots lie not in some grand scientific quest, but in a contest between two cereals. The thing done to those boys began, at bottom, as a question of marketing. In those years, the makers of oatmeal and the makers of a rival cereal made from wheat were competing for the breakfast tables of America, and nutrition had become the language of the competition. Advertisements promised health, strength, growing bodies, strong bones. But there was a wrinkle in the science of grains, a real and genuine puzzle. Plant-based cereals contained natural compounds that might interfere with the body's ability to absorb the very minerals the cereals were supposed to provide, the iron and the calcium that built blood and bone. If oatmeal's goodness was being blocked on its way into the body, that was a problem the oat company very much wanted to understand, and ideally to disprove. So the company turned to a great university across the river from the school and offered to fund research. And the researchers there, nutrition scientists with the instruments and the expertise, proposed a way to settle the question precisely. They would use tracers. A tracer is a tiny amount of a radioactive substance attached to something you wish to follow, in this case to the iron and the calcium in the food. Because the radioactive atoms give off a faint signal that instruments can detect, scientists can follow the tagged minerals through the body, can measure how much is taken up and how much passes through, can chart with real numbers the journey of breakfast through a growing child. The method was clever. The method, in the abstract, was sound. The radioactive amounts were, by the measures of the day, and even by stricter measures later, very small. And to do the study properly, the researchers needed children, growing children specifically, since the question was about how growing bodies absorbed minerals. They needed children whose every meal could be controlled, who would eat exactly the tagged food and nothing that would spoil the measurement, who would remain available for weeks of careful collection, who would give blood when asked and stool and urine when asked, since following the minerals all the way through required following everything that came out as well as everything that went in. They needed, in the chillingly practical phrase one of them would later use, control of the subjects. And the school off Trapello Road, with its captive wards of boys and its cooperative superintendent, offered exactly that control. So the funding flowed, from the cereal company and from the agencies of the government, including the body that managed the nation's radioactive materials in those early atomic years, and the isotopes were supplied, and the study was designed, and the science club was invented as the friendly face that would gather the subjects. Over a span of years, several dozen boys took part across the different experiments. They ate the iron-tagged oats. They drank the calcium-tagged milk. In some of the work, the radioactive calcium was not eaten at all, but injected directly. A needle into the arm of a boy who had been told he was special, and given a watch and promised a ball game. And all the while the instruments measured, and the numbers accumulated, and the careful columns of the notebooks filled with data. It is important to be exact and fair about the physical danger, because the truth here is genuinely complicated, and the complication is part of the lesson. The doses of radiation involved were small. Later, when investigators and task forces examined the studies in detail, they concluded that the amounts were low, comparable to a year of the ordinary background radiation a person receives simply from living on the Earth, or to a series of medical X-rays, and that they probably did not cause measurable physical harm to the boys. This is true, and it must be said, because the story is sometimes told as though the children were dosed with something that killed them, and that is not what happened. By the cold measure of physical injury, the radiation itself most likely left no lasting mark on their bodies. But notice the trap that this fact lays, the very trap the defenders of the work would spring for decades. The smallness of the dose was used again and again as though it answered the charge, as though the question were only whether the children had been physically hurt, and as though, the children not having been physically hurt, no real wrong had been done. This is the argument of a man who has missed the point on purpose. The wrong was never primarily about the dose. The wrong was about everything around the dose. It was about feeding children a radioactive substance without telling them. It was about deceiving their families with a warm letter that left out the one word that mattered. It was about choosing these children precisely because they were powerless, and using their hunger to be chosen as the bait that secured their cooperation. Imagine the same study done honestly. Imagine the scientist going to a school of ordinary children, the sons and daughters of professors and lawyers and shopkeepers, and saying plainly to their parents, "We would like to add a tiny amount of radioactive material to your child's breakfast so that we can study how the food moves through his body. The risk is very low, here is exactly what it involves, and you are completely free to say no." Some parents, told the truth, might even have agreed. But the scientists did not do that, and the reason they did not is the whole indictment. They did not ask the powerful honestly because the powerful might have refused, or asked hard questions, or demanded oversight. They went to the powerless instead, and told them only what was needed to keep the meeting, because the powerless could not refuse and would not be believed. And what did all of it produce, this clever, careful, deceptive work? It produced data, good, clean data, the kind that pleases everyone who paid for it. The studies found what the cereal company had hoped they would find. The natural compounds in the grains did not, after all, block the absorption of the minerals to any troubling degree. Oatmeal delivered its iron. Oatmeal with milk delivered its calcium. The goodness got through. The numbers were favourable. The company that had funded the research was, by the accounts of those involved, greatly pleased with the result. The science had done its job. The product was vindicated. The breakfast was good for you after all. Hold those two facts together in the quiet, because their juxtaposition is the entire moral of the chapter. On one side, a set of clean and useful findings, honestly obtained by the rules of the laboratory, doses small, methods sound, sponsor satisfied. On the other side, a group of children who had been deceived, whose trust had been used, whose powerlessness had been the silent precondition of the whole enterprise, and who would not learn for 40 years what had been quietly mixed into the warm breakfast of their lonely childhoods. The study was, by its own measures, a success. That is exactly the problem. It was a success, and it was wrong, and the people who ran it never could see that those two things could both be true at once. Return for a moment to the letter that went home to the families, because it repays a closer reading, and because it shows how deception can be accomplished entirely with true sentences. The letter spoke of a special study. It spoke of extra milk, a whole quart a day. It spoke of trips to the ball game and the beach and to dinners, and of how greatly the boys would enjoy these things. It expressed the hope that the family would have no objection, and it arranged matters so that silence would count as consent, so that a family that simply did not reply would be taken to have agreed. Every individual claim in the letter was, in its way, accurate. The boys did get the milk. They did go to the games, they did enjoy it. And yet the letter was a lie assembled entirely out of truths, because of the one thing it did not say. It did not say that the special breakfast carried radioactive material. It did not say that the purpose was not to benefit the boys, but to gather data for a study funded by a cereal company and an agency of the government. It did not say that the children were subjects rather than beneficiaries, that the milk and the trips were inducements rather than gifts, that something was being put into their bodies that their families would surely have wished to know about. The letter achieved deception not by stating falsehoods, but by withholding the single fact that would have changed the meaning of all the true facts around it. This is the most respectable kind of lie, the kind that can always claim, afterward, that nothing untrue was ever said. The deeper origin of the whole enterprise, remember, was a commercial dispute about breakfast cereal, and it is worth holding on to that, because it punctures any grand justification. This was not a desperate search for a cure to a killing disease. It was a question about whether one porridge delivered its minerals as well as another, a question that mattered chiefly to the companies selling the porridges. The science was real and the method was clever, but the stakes, in human terms, were modest, a matter of marketing and market share. And to settle this modest question, men were willing to feed radioactive material to institutionalized children under false pretenses. The smallness of the purpose, set beside the seriousness of the violation, is itself part of the indictment. The children were not even being used for something that could pretend to be momentous. They were being used to win an argument about cereal. The defense that the doses were tiny is true and must be granted again in fairness, and again it misses the point in a way that is almost instructive. Suppose the radiation truly caused no measurable physical harm, as the later task forces concluded it likely did not. The wrong is undiminished, because the wrong was never located in the physical effect. The wrong was located in the act of putting something into a child's body without honest consent, in choosing that child precisely because his powerlessness made honest consent unnecessary, in treating his body as available for use in a way no free person's body would have been. A trespass is a trespass even if it leaves no bruise. To enter where you have no right to enter is the violation, whatever you do or do not break once inside. And the data, clean and favourable, came in and pleased the sponsor, and that is where the matter rested for 40 years, a closed and satisfactory file. The minerals were absorbed, the cereal was vindicated, the study had answered its question. By every standard the men applied to their own work it had gone well, and they moved on to other questions, and the boys grew up, and the boxes went to the basement, and nothing in the careful columns of data recorded the one quantity the study had never thought to measure, which was the trust of the children who had eaten the breakfast believing they were loved. It is worth pausing on the strange modernity of the whole arrangement, the way it joined together things we do not usually picture together: a children's institution, a great research university, a breakfast cereal company, and the agency that managed the nation's atomic materials. These were not natural partners, and yet they came together smoothly around the bodies of these boys, each bringing what it had, the institution bringing the captive children, the university bringing the expertise, the company bringing the money and the commercial question, the atomic agency bringing the radioactive traces. 4 very different powers, converging on a bowl of oatmeal in a state school, each pursuing its own perfectly ordinary interest, and the convergence produced a wrong that none of them, individually, quite had to own. This is how harm gets done in a complex modern society, not by a single hand but by a web of hands, each doing something that, on its own, looks unremarkable. The company only wanted to know about its cereal. The university only wanted to do good research and secure its funding. The atomic agency only wanted to support the study of how radiation and the body interact. The institution only wanted the prestige and the resources that cooperation brought. No single party set out to harm children, but their interests met at the point of greatest convenience, which happened to be the captive bodies of boys who could not refuse, and at that meeting point, the harm occurred, distributed across all of them, and concentrated in none, which is exactly the arrangement in which conscience goes to die. The radioactive traces themselves, those tiny tagged atoms, are worth understanding without fear, because the fear distorts the story. A tracer is not a poison in the ordinary sense. It is a small quantity of a substance that gives off a faint detectable signal attached to something the scientists wish to follow, so that its journey through the body can be measured. The technique is genuinely useful, and is still, in carefully governed forms, used in medicine today to diagnose and to understand. The amounts used at the school were very small, and the physical risk, by the later judgment of careful reviewers, was correspondingly small. The tracers were not what made the thing a crime. What made it a crime was everything around the tracers: the deception, the captivity, the absence of true consent, the choosing of these particular children precisely because they could be used without honest agreement. Strip the radioactivity out of the story entirely. Imagine the very same arrangement with some harmless marker, and the wrong would be almost undiminished, because the wrong was never essentially about radiation. It was about putting something into children's bodies for purposes that were not their own, without telling them or anyone who could protect them the truth, because they had been judged not to require the truth. The radioactivity gives the story its lurid headline, but the offence underneath the headline would have been an offence with no radioactivity at all. This matters because the headline can mislead in 2 directions at once. It can make the thing seem worse than it physically was, conjuring images of poisoned, dying children that the facts do not support. And it can let the defenders off the hook, because once they have shown that no child was physically harmed by the radiation, they can act as though the charge has been answered, as though physical harm were the only possible charge. Both errors flow from fixating on the substance in the bowl. The truer view looks past the substance to the relationship and asks not what was the dose but what was the consent. And finding the consent absent and the children captive and the families deceived, it reaches its verdict, and the verdict does not depend on the size of the dose at all. Let the dining hall fade now, the boys at their bowls, the instruments humming in a laboratory across the river, the numbers filling their careful columns. The radiation will do them little physical harm, and that is a small mercy, and it is not the point. The point is the warm letter with its missing word, and the watches on the thin wrists, and the children eating in happy ignorance the breakfast that had been chosen for them by men who knew exactly what they were not saying. We will widen the story now beyond this one school to an island near a great city, where children were given not a hidden thing in their food, but the very thing the doctors most wished to study, a disease. On an island that sits within sight of one of the largest cities in the world, there stood another institution, vast and overcrowded, built to hold children whom the world had set aside. It was a state school for children with disabilities, and it grew, over the years, to hold thousands of them, far more than it had ever been meant to hold, packed into wards where the ratio of children to attendants made anything like real care impossible. It would become, in time, one of the most infamous names in the whole history of how a society treats its most vulnerable, a name spoken with a shudder. But for many years it was simply a place that existed, out of sight, doing what such places did. The conditions there, when they were finally shown to the public, shocked even a public that thought itself unshockable. Children left half-clothed, wards that smelled of neglect, too few hands to feed, to bathe, to comfort, to teach. It was a warehouse on the larger scale, and into its crowded wards came, as into the others, the same confident men with the same important purposes. For this place offered something even the orphanage and the school could not. It offered a disease. The disease was hepatitis, an infection of the liver, and in those crowded wards it spread almost universally. The conditions were such that a child admitted healthy would, with grim reliability, soon be infected, past the illness through the ordinary closeness of institutional life. To a researcher studying the disease, this was, in the terrible logic we have already seen, an opportunity rather than a scandal. Here was a place where the infection was practically guaranteed. Here, therefore, was a place where the infection could be studied under conditions of near-perfect control. And so a program of research began that crossed a line even darker than the hidden tracer in the oatmeal. The children in these studies were not merely deceived about what was in their food. They were, in a number of cases, deliberately given the disease. They were exposed on purpose to the agent of the infection, so that the doctors could watch the illness unfold from its very beginning, could test whether certain preparations might protect against it, could chart its course in a way that observing already sick children would not allow. The justification, offered then and defended for years afterward, was that the children would almost certainly have caught the disease anyway, given where they lived, and that by studying it the doctors might find a way to defeat it, for these children and for all the children of the future. Sit with that justification, because it is the most sophisticated and the most seductive in the whole story, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than simply dismissed. It is not stupid. It is not obviously evil. The disease really was nearly inescapable in that place. The research really did contribute in the end to genuine medical progress, to a real understanding of the different forms of the illness, and ultimately toward the protection of countless people. A defender could say, and did say, that the children lost little they would not have lost anyway, and that the world gained much. By a certain arithmetic the books seem to balance. But follow that arithmetic to its root and see what it rests on. It rests first on the fact that the children were in that diseased place at all, a fact that was itself an injustice, the overcrowding and the neglect that made the infection inevitable. The researcher took the wrongness of the institution as a fixed feature of the world, like weather, and reasoned from it, rather than seeing it as the very thing that should have been fixed. He said in effect, since these children are already being failed so badly that they will get sick no matter what, I may as well make use of their sickness. The injustice became the justification. The harm already being done was used to license a further harm, dressed now in the language of science and the promise of future good. And it rests, second, on the same decision we have seen everywhere in this story, made again in a new and starker form. The decision that these particular children did not need to be truly asked, that their parents, poor and frightened and desperate for any institution that would take a child they could not care for, could be presented with consent forms that framed the research as a benefit, sometimes as a condition of the child's admission or care, in ways that made true refusal nearly unthinkable. The powerful are asked, the powerless are managed. The difference between a request and a maneuver is the difference between respecting a person and using one, and on that island, as in the school, as in the orphanage, the children were used. What ties all these places together, across the miles and the years and the different substances and methods, is not a conspiracy. No one sat in a room and planned it all. What ties them together is a shared and unspoken belief, so deep that the men who held it did not know they held it, that some children counted and some did not, that the children of the comfortable were ends in themselves, to be protected and consulted and never risked, while the children of the institutions were means, available, controllable, expendable in the small ways that science found convenient. The same hand that locked these children away for being unwanted reached back in to make use of them precisely because they were unwanted. The two acts were one act. The cage and the experiment were built from the same idea. You can see now why this story cannot be told as a series of isolated outrages, a bad apple here and a bad apple there. The orphanage by the river, the school off Trapelo Road, the great institution on the island, and the dozens of other places like them that this knight has no time to visit, were not exceptions to the values of their age. They were expressions of those values carried to a conclusion. A society that builds warehouses for its inconvenient children has already done the hard moral work of deciding those children matter less. The experiments only spent what the institutions had already saved up. They drew on an account of human worth that had been quietly opened and overdrawn long before any scientist arrived. The defense offered for the work on the island deserves to be taken apart slowly, because it is the most intelligent defense in the whole story, and intelligent defenses of indefensible things are exactly what we most need to learn to recognize. The argument ran like this. The disease was everywhere in the institution. A child admitted there would almost certainly catch it, whether anyone studied him or not. Therefore, deliberately exposing a child to it added little to his risk, since the risk was already near certain, and in exchange the study might produce knowledge that would protect many. The child lost almost nothing. The world gained much. Where, the defender asked, is the harm? The first thing to notice is that the argument quietly accepts the worst injustice as a fixed fact and reasons forward from it. The disease was everywhere because the institution was overcrowded and neglected, because thousands of children had been packed into a place that could not care for them. That overcrowding was not a law of nature, it was a scandal, a failure, a wrong in itself that demanded to be fixed. The honest response to a place so diseased that infection was inevitable was to be appalled, to insist that no child should live in such conditions. The researcher's response was different. He looked at the inevitability of the infection and saw, instead of an emergency, an opportunity. He took the scandal as his given and built his science on top of it, and in doing so he made himself a beneficiary of the very neglect that should have outraged him. The second thing to notice is the sleight of hand in the phrase would have caught it anyway. Even if true, it does not transfer to the researcher the right to do the infecting. That a child standing in a dangerous place might be struck by misfortune does not entitle a passing adult to strike him deliberately, and call it harmless on the grounds that misfortune was coming regardless. The deliberate act has a different moral character from the ambient risk, because it introduces a will, a chooser, a person who decided to do this thing to this child for his own purposes. To deliberately give a child a disease is to make oneself the author of his suffering, and one cannot escape that authorship by pointing out that the suffering might have arrived by some other road. And the third thing to notice is that the consent obtained was consent in the same hollow sense we have seen throughout. The families were poor and frightened and desperate for any place that would take a child they could not manage. They were presented with forms that framed participation as a benefit, sometimes in contexts where refusal seemed to threaten the child's care or admission. A signature given under such pressure, by a parent who has been told a reassuring and partial story and who has nowhere else to turn, is not the free and informed agreement that consent is supposed to be. It is a formality, a piece of paper that launders the use of the child into the appearance of permission, and the appearance was all the system required. That the work did contribute to real medical progress is the final and most uncomfortable truth, and it must not be denied, because denying it would make the lesson too easy. Knowledge genuinely came from these studies, knowledge that helped in the long fight against the disease and that ultimately served the protection of many people who never knew the names of the children who had paid for it. This is precisely what makes the case so instructive and so dangerous. It is easy to condemn a cruelty that produces nothing. It is hard and necessary to condemn a cruelty that produces something valuable, to hold firmly to the truth that good results do not cleanse a wrongful method, that a benefit extracted from a person who could not refuse remains a thing taken rather than a thing given, no matter how many later strangers are helped by it. The end does not sanctify the means. The children were not asked. That settles it, whatever the studies achieved. The island institution, when its conditions were finally exposed to the wider world, became a byword for everything a society can do wrong to its most dependent members, and the exposure of those conditions belongs to the same long process that uncovered the experiments. For years the place had operated out of sight, its overcrowding and neglect known only to those inside and to the families who had little choice but to leave their children there. When at last the cameras came in and showed the public what such a place actually looked like, the response was shock, outrage, a refusal to believe that this had been allowed to exist. But it had existed for years in plain administrative view, funded and overseen and tolerated because the children it held were the children a society prefers not to look at. And it is the connection between the neglect and the experiments that holds the deepest lesson. The same conditions that made the institution a place of suffering, the crowding, the understaffing, the absence of anyone to advocate for the individual child, were the conditions that made it attractive to researchers. A place so overcrowded that disease spreads through it unchecked is, to the right kind of eye, a natural laboratory. A population so neglected that no one tracks the individual child is a population easy to enroll and easy to follow. The neglect and the experimentation were not two separate scandals that happened to share a location. They were the same scandal, the using of children who had been placed beyond protection, expressed in two registers at once. To see this clearly is to understand why the eventual reforms had to address not just the experiments, but the institutions themselves. It was not enough to write rules forbidding researchers from deceiving subjects, though such rules were needed and came. The deeper remedy was to question the existence of these vast warehouses of forgotten children, to ask whether any child should be kept in such conditions at all, to begin the long and incomplete process of emptying them, of finding better ways to care for the dependent than packing them by the thousand into places no one watched. The experiments were a symptom. The institution was the disease, and a society that wished to prevent the symptom had, eventually, to confront the disease. That confrontation, when it came, was driven in large part by the families and the former residents themselves, by the same kind of gathering and speaking that recovered the truth about the experiments. People who had been treated as voiceless found their voices, told what they had seen and suffered, forced a comfortable public to look at what it had preferred to ignore. The exposure of the island institution and the exposure of the experiments were parts of one broad awakening, a society at last being made to see the children it had hidden, and being shamed, slowly and incompletely, into treating them as children rather than as material, as ends rather than as means, as persons rather than as problems to be stored. So when we hold the island in mind, let us hold the whole of it, the neglect and the experiments together, the crowded wards and the deliberate infections, and see them for the single thing they were. They were what happens when a society decides that certain children may be set aside beyond the reach of the protections that guard everyone else. Everything else followed from that decision, the suffering and the science alike. And the long remedy, still unfinished in our own day, is simply the reversal of that decision. The slow and difficult insistence that there is no such thing as a child who may be set aside, that the protections must reach everyone, that no human being, however dependent, however inconvenient, however far from the centres of power, falls outside the circle of those who may not be used. Let the island grow dim now, its crowded wards, its inevitable disease, its careful researchers with their genuine hopes and their borrowed children. There is no villain here to hiss at and feel clean. There is only the long, soft, terrible logic of a world that had sorted its children into those who must be protected, and those who could be used, and had been so sure of the sorting that it printed the results, in respectable journals and called them contributions to knowledge. We come now to the word itself, the word that has told quietly through this whole night, and to the strange machinery of justification that allowed good and careful people to look at what they had done to the children no one came for and to call it, without flinching, a success. Now we come to the word. It has been sounding softly in the next room all night, and it is time to walk in and look at it directly. Success. When the work in these places was done, when the data were gathered, and the columns filled and the samples analysed, the people responsible did not, on the whole, feel that they had done something terrible and hidden it in shame. They felt that they had done something good. They wrote it up. They published it, much of it, openly, in the journals their colleagues read. They presented the findings at conferences. They regarded the studies as accomplishments, as contributions, as wins. And for decades, when challenged, they would defend them with the calm conviction of people who believe they have nothing to apologise for. This is the part of the story that is hardest for us looking back to absorb. We expect wrongdoing to know itself as wrongdoing. We expect the guilty to skulk, to conceal, to feel the weight of what they have done. But the men in this story largely did not skulk. They were proud. One of the researchers from the school, asked about the radioactive feeding studies long afterward, when the world had begun to recoil from them, said that he felt just as good about it on the day he was asked as he had on the day he did it. The attitude of the scientists, he explained, had been that they were going to do the work in the best possible way. He was not lying, and he was not, in the ordinary sense, ashamed. He genuinely could not see what all the fuss was about. How is that possible? How does a decent person look at the deception of children and the use of the powerless and feel good about it for a lifetime? The answer is the quiet machinery of justification, and it is worth examining each of its gears, because the same machinery runs in smaller ways in all of us, and recognizing it is the only protection against it. The first gear is the importance of the goal. The work was for knowledge, and knowledge was sacred, and a sacred goal sanctifies the means. When you believe with your whole heart that what you are doing serves the relief of human suffering, that it advances medicine, that it will help children yet unborn, the ordinary scruples come to seem small, even selfish, obstacles thrown up by the squeamish in the path of progress. The greater the imagined good, the smaller the actual harm appears beside it. A child's trust, a family's right to the truth. These are real, but they are quiet and particular, and they are easily outshouted by the bright abstraction of science, of progress, of the future. The second gear is the smallness of the harm, or what could be told as smallness. The dose was tiny, the discomfort was brief. The children would have caught the disease anyway. Each study had, ready to hand, a way of making its particular harm look negligible, a comparison that shrank it, a number that reassured. And because the harm to any single child was, in physical terms, often genuinely small, the gear turned smoothly. The men could say, truthfully, that no child was poisoned, that the radiation was less than a year of sunshine, that the illness was endemic regardless, and each true statement helped them not to see the untrue thing they were resting it on, which was that smallness of physical harm could excuse the violation of trust. The third gear is the invisibility of the victim. The children could not answer back. They had no platform, no voice, no advocate who would be heard. They scattered into adulthood and silence. A wrong done to someone who can protest stays alive, keeps pressing its claim, refuses to be forgotten. A wrong done to someone who cannot protest sinks quietly out of view, and the comfortable conscience, hearing no complaint, concludes that there is nothing to complain about. The very powerlessness that made the children useful as subjects made them useless as accusers, and so the accusation was never made, and the men were never forced to hear it, and they went on feeling fine. And the fourth gear, turning beneath all the others, is the simple fact of company. None of these men did these things alone. They did them alongside respected colleagues, with the blessing of prestigious institutions, funded by reputable companies and agencies of the government, in full view of their peers, who were all doing similar things and all agreeing that it was acceptable. When everyone around you treats a thing as normal, it becomes nearly impossible to see it as monstrous. The crowd carries the conscience. A man alone might have hesitated. A man surrounded by men who do not hesitate finds his own hesitation melting away, reabsorbed into the calm consensus that this is simply how serious work is done. Put the 4 gears together and you have a machine that can take an ordinary, intelligent, even kindly human being and walk him, step by reasonable step, to the deception of children, and leave him at the end feeling not guilty but accomplished. No single step requires villainy. Each is small, each is defensible, each is shared by everyone he respects, and at the end of the sequence stands the word, ready to be applied, success. The hypothesis was tested, the product was vindicated, the disease was charted, the data were good. By every measure the men had been trained to honour, the work had succeeded, and so they called it a success, and they were not, by their own lights, wrong to do so. The trouble is that there was another measure entirely, a measure their training had taught them to overlook, and by that measure every one of these triumphs was a defeat. It is the measure that asks not whether the data were good, but whether the children were treated as persons, not whether the goal was important, but whether the cost was theirs to impose, not whether the harm was small, but whether it was theirs to inflict at all, on children who had not been asked, who could not refuse, who trusted them. By that measure the radiation studies and the disease studies and the study by the river were not successes that happened to have an ethical cost. They were ethical failures that happened to produce data. The success and the wrong were not separate things to be weighed against each other. The wrong was woven through the success, was the condition of it, was the reason the data could be had so cleanly and so cheaply. This is the quiet revolution that the rest of the century would slowly bring, though far too late for the children in this story. The realization that a thing can be scientifically excellent and morally bankrupt at the same time, and that when it is, the excellence does not redeem it but indicts it further, because it shows what the wrong was for. The data those children paid for were good data. That is not their consolation, it is their accusation. The cleaner the numbers, the more complete the control, the more total the deception that produced them. There is a 5th gear, quieter than the other 4, and it may be the most important of all, because it operates not at the moment of the deed, but in all the years afterward. It is the gear of the sunk self. Once a person has done a thing and built an identity on its being acceptable, the cost of admitting it was wrong becomes almost unbearable, because the admission would unmake not just an act but a life. The man who fed the children and called it science cannot at 70 simply concede that it was a violation, because to concede that is to indict his younger self, his whole career, the meaning he made of his days. So he does not concede it. He defends it, more firmly with each passing year, not because the evidence has changed, but because the self that would have to absorb the verdict has grown too large and too settled to survive it. This is why the defenders grew more entrenched, not less, as the world turned against them. You might expect that the gathering judgment of a later age would soften them, prompt some reflection, some opening. Often it did the opposite. The more the world insisted the work was wrong, the more fiercely they insisted it was fine, because by then their whole sense of themselves depended on it being fine. To say I feel just as good about it today as the day I did it is not really a statement about the work at all. It is a statement about the impossibility of feeling otherwise without collapsing. The man is not defending the study. He is defending his right to have been a good man all along, and he will defend that to his last breath, because the alternative is to have been something else for his entire life. Understand this gear and you understand why apology is so rare and reckoning so slow. It is not usually that wrongdoers are unusually wicked. It is that admission is unusually expensive, and the price rises with every year of investment in the contrary story. The young are sometimes capable of recognizing a fresh wrong, because they have not yet built their lives on it. The old, who have built everything on it, almost never can. The capacity to say, I was wrong about something central is one of the rarest and most costly acts a human being can perform, and most people, faced with its price, simply decline to pay and go to their graves with the defense intact, sincerely. And this is why the verdict, when it finally comes, so often has to come from outside, from a later generation that has no self invested in the old arrangement and can therefore see it plainly. The people who did the thing will rarely be the ones to name it. The naming falls to those who come after, who inherit the records and the distance, who can look at the careful columns of data and the warm, deceptive letters without any need to have been right about them. Moral progress in this light is less a matter of individuals changing their minds than of generations replacing one another, the new arriving unburdened by the old commitments, free to see what their elders could not afford to see. So when we judge the men of this story, let us judge the act clearly, and the persons with a certain weary understanding, not to excuse them, but to learn from them. They were caught in a machine of justification that we too could be caught in, are perhaps caught in now, in ways our own grandchildren will name and we cannot. The importance of the goal, the smallness of the harm, the silence of the victim, the comfort of company, and the unbearable cost of admission, these gears turn in every age and in every heart, and they can grind anyone, given the right arrangement, into a person who does harm and calls it good, and believes it to the end. The only defence is to know the machine exists, to distrust our own certainty most precisely when it feels most justified, and to listen, always, for the voice of the one who cannot speak, which is the one voice the machine is built to silence. The word success in the mouths of the men who used it was not a boast. That is what makes it so unsettling. A boast knows it is reaching for more than it deserves. These men were not reaching. They were stating calmly what seemed to them a plain fact. The study had set out to answer a question, and it had answered it. The data were sound, the method rigorous, the finding clear. By the internal logic of their craft, the work had succeeded as surely as a bridge that bears its load has succeeded, and to call it a success was simply to describe it accurately, the way one describes any competent piece of work that achieved what it set out to achieve. And this is precisely the trap, because the internal logic of a craft can be entirely sound and still be pointed at the wrong thing. A craft measures itself by its own standards, and its own standards concern only the quality of the work, not the rightness of undertaking it. A study can be measured for rigour, for control, for the cleanness of its data, and can score perfectly on all of these, while the deeper question, the question of whether it should have been done at all, falls entirely outside the scale. The men had instruments to measure everything except the one thing that mattered most, and so that one thing, unmeasured, simply dropped out of their judgment, and what remained, fully measured and fully passing, they called a success. You can see the same blindness in any field that prizes excellence without asking what the excellence serves. The work can be beautiful, masterful, a triumph of skill, and the skill can be entirely in the service of something that should not be done. We are trained, all of us, to admire competence, to respect the thing done well, and this training is mostly good, but it carries a hidden danger, which is that it can lead us to praise the doing and never ask about the deed. The men who studied the children were genuinely competent. Their competence is not in doubt. It is exactly their competence, untethered from any question about what it was for, that allowed them to do harm with such clean hands and call the result good. The corrective is not to despise competence, but to insist that it answer to something beyond itself. To ask of any impressive work before admiring it, what it is in the service of, who pays for it, whether those who pay have agreed to pay. To hold that no degree of rigour can redeem a wrongful aim, that a perfectly conducted study of an unconsenting child is not a lesser wrong than a sloppy one, but in some ways a greater one, because its very perfection depended on the completeness of the control, and the completeness of the control depended on the helplessness of the subject. The cleaner the data, the more total the using. Excellence, in such a case, is not a mitigating fact. It is an aggravating one. That is the hard inversion this story presses on us, and it is worth carrying past the moment of the men and into our own lives. We are surrounded by impressive things, achievements, efficiencies, triumphs of method and skill, and we are taught to admire them, and mostly we are right to. But the children teach us to ask the further question, always, the question the men never asked, which is not how well was this done, but whether it should have been done, and at whose expense, and with whose consent. A success that cannot survive that question is not a success at all. It is only a wrong, performed with skill, and the skill is the last thing about it that deserves our praise. Let the word grow quiet again now, ringing more faintly, losing its old confident tone. Success. It was a success. The men who said it were sincere, and they were respected, and they were terribly, comprehensively wrong, not because their science was bad, but because their idea of what counts had a hole in it, exactly the shape of a powerless child. We have looked at the word as long as we need to. Now we will watch the long silence that followed, the decades in which the children grew up not knowing, the records slept in their boxes, and the word success sat undisturbed in the journals, waiting for the day someone would finally read it back and hear how it sounded. And then nothing happened for a very long time. That is the strange, slow centre of this story. The part that has no drama in it at all, only the quiet passage of years. The studies ended. The clubs disbanded. The children grew up. The world moved into the second half of the century, into new wars and new music and new machines, and the things that had been done in the institutions simply receded, the way everything recedes, into the grey country of the past. The records did not vanish. They were not burned. They were merely set down in folders and boxes on shelves in basements and libraries, and left there and forgotten, which is a kind of vanishing that requires no malice at all. Picture the boxes. This is, in its way, the most haunting image in the whole account, more haunting than any single moment in any single ward, because it is so ordinary. Somewhere in the library of the school off Trapelo Road, the papers from the feeding studies sat in a jumble of cardboard boxes gathering dust, neither hidden nor hunted for 40 years. The numbers were in there, the names were in there, the careful record of what had been mixed into the breakfasts of those boys was in there, available to anyone who thought to look, and for 4 decades, almost no one did. The truth was not locked away. It was simply unwanted, like the children it concerned. Meanwhile, the children themselves became adults, and the adults aged, and they carried their childhoods with them the way everyone does, only with a hole in the middle where an explanation should have been. The boys from the science club remembered the watches, the milk, the trips to the ball game. They remembered being chosen, the warm, bright feeling of it. They did not know what had been in the oatmeal. They had been told they were special and helping with important work, and they had no reason and no way to learn that the special breakfast had carried, into their growing bodies, a thing the men had chosen not to name. They lived their whole adult lives without the one fact that would have changed how they understood their own childhoods. The girl from the room by the river grew up too, and ran from the orphanage, and made a life, and married, and never told her husband what had been done to her in that small plain room, because she did not fully have the words for it, and because the shame the experiment had planted in her was a private thing that felt like it belonged to her rather than to the people who had put it there. "It ruined my life," she said, much later, when at last she understood. But for decades she did not understand. She only lived with the effect and had no name for the cause. The experiment had reached into her childhood and altered the course of her life, and then it had withdrawn, leaving no fingerprint she could see. This is the cruelty of the long silence. The second injury laid quietly over the first. To be harmed is one thing. To be harmed and not know why is another, and worse. The children of these studies spent their lives feeling effects they could not trace, carrying a withdrawnness, a shame, a vague sense of having been used, with nothing to attach it to. They could not be angry, because they did not know what to be angry about. They could not seek redress, because they did not know there was anything to seek redress for. They could not even properly grieve, because grief needs an object, and theirs had been hidden from them. The silence did not just protect the men, it deprived the children of the truth of their own lives. And the men, through all those years, were mostly fine. Some of them died honoured, with their names on institutes and their obituaries listing their contributions to science. Their work sat in the journals, cited, built upon, part of the respectable record. No one came to their doors, no reporter called. The thing they had done had passed the test that, in this world, decides whether a wrong will ever be answered for, the test of whether the victims have power, and the victims had none, and so the wrong simply aged into history alongside its perpetrators, quiet and unremarked. A man can do a terrible thing, and if he does it to the powerless, live out his days in peace. That is not a comforting truth, but it is a true one, and this story insists on it. You might ask, drifting here in the dark, how a whole society forgets such things. But it's not really forgetting, because forgetting implies that the thing was once widely known. Most people never knew at all. The studies were technical, buried in specialized journals, of interest only to other specialists. The institutions were closed and out of sight. The children were invisible by design. There was no scandal to forget because there had never been a moment of public reckoning to begin with. The knowledge existed, in the boxes and the journals, but it was sealed inside a small professional world that had already decided it was acceptable. And outside that world there was only silence, which is not the same as forgetting. It is the absence of ever having heard. And so the years stacked up, even and quiet, like the bells of the institution, each one like the last. The boxes sat in the basements, the children aged into grandparents, the men aged into eminences. The word success rested in the journals, undisturbed, its old confidence intact because no one had yet read it back to the world in a voice that made the world flinch. The whole vast wrong lay dormant, complete, recorded and unanswered, waiting as such things wait for an accident, for a door to open somewhere it had not been meant to open, for a single curious person to pull a folder from a box and begin to read. There is a particular stillness to a wrong that has gone unanswered for decades. It is not peace, though it can look like peace from far enough away. It is more like the stillness of deep water over something heavy that has sunk. The surface is calm. The town goes about its business. The institute keeps its honoured name. And down below, in the boxes and the files and the aging memories of scattered men and women, the thing lies waiting, neither gone nor seen, perfectly preserved by the very silence that hides it, until the day the water is finally disturbed. The lives the children went on to live were, in their outward shape, ordinary lives, and that ordinariness is part of what the silence cost. They left the institutions, those who left, and found work, and some of them married, and some had children of their own, and they moved through the decades as everyone moves through them, through the years of building and the years of raising and the years of growing older. From the outside, nothing marked them. They were neighbours, co-workers, men and women you might pass in a shop without a second glance. The thing that had been done to them was invisible, even to them, folded away inside childhoods they could not fully explain. But the invisible thing made itself felt in the quiet ways that early wounds make themselves felt across a whole life. A reluctance, perhaps, that the person could not account for, a difficulty trusting, a sense of having been used that attached to nothing specific. For the boys of the science club there might be a vague unease about the institution, a memory of the watches and the milk that carried, underneath its sweetness, a faint and unnameable wrongness they could not bring into focus. For the children of the room by the river, there might be the lifelong shadow on their confidence, the shame about their own speech or their own worth, planted so early and so deep that it felt simply like a fact about themselves rather than something that had been done to them by another person's hand. This is the particular cruelty of harm done in secret to the very young. A wound you can name is a wound you can fight. You can be angry at the one who gave it, seek redress, tell the story, set the blame where it belongs, and so begin, slowly, to set yourself free of it. But a wound you cannot name turns inward and becomes part of your idea of yourself. The shame the experiment planted in the orphan girl did not feel, to her, like an injury inflicted by Mary Tudor and Wendell Johnson. It felt like the truth about her, a flaw she carried, a thing wrong with her. She could not be angry at the right target because she did not know there was a target. The blame that belonged to the men dissolved, in her, into blame against herself. And so the survivors carried for decades not only the original harm but the additional burden of not knowing its source, of mistaking the consequences of someone else's wrong for facts about their own nature. This is a kind of theft on top of the first theft. The men took the children's trust, and the silence then took from the grown children even the knowledge of what had been taken, leaving them to puzzle over effects whose cause had been hidden from them. To live a whole life shaped by a wrong you have never been allowed to know about is to be robbed twice, once of the thing itself, and once of the truth that might have let you understand it. That is why the eventual breaking of the silence mattered so much, beyond any settlement or apology, and why we should not measure the reckoning only in money. When the truth finally came out, it gave the survivors something money cannot buy. It gave them the cause of their own lives. It let the orphan girl, now old, understand at last that the shadow she'd carried was not the truth about her, but a thing that had been done to her, that the fault was never hers, that she had been a healthy and ordinary child harmed by adults who should have protected her. To learn that, even at 70, even too late to undo any of it, is to be handed back a piece of yourself that was stolen in childhood. It is the difference between believing you are broken and knowing you were wronged, and that difference, to a person who has carried the wrong belief for a lifetime, is very nearly everything. Time moved differently for the two sets of people in this story during the long silence, and the difference is worth feeling. For the men, time moved forward and upward, through careers, through honours, through the steady accumulation of a respected life. Each year added to their standing. The studies receded comfortably behind them, finished business, a line on a long record of accomplishment. They aged, as everyone ages, but they aged in security, surrounded by the evidence of their own importance, untroubled by the children, who had become, if they thought of them at all, merely the subjects of some early work. Long concluded, never questioned. For the children, time moved differently, not forward and upward, but in a kind of suspension, because the thing that had shaped them was unknown to them, and so could not be processed, could not be put in its place, could not be made into a finished part of the past. An ordinary painful memory can be worked through, understood, slowly integrated, set at last at a bearable distance. But the children could not work through what they did not know. The shame, the withdrawal, the unease, sat inside them unresolved, not because they refused to deal with it, but because they had been denied the knowledge that would have let them deal with it. Their wound could not heal because its cause had been hidden, and a wound whose cause is hidden does not close, it only waits. And so they carried it, year after year, this unresolvable thing, through their adult lives. It surfaced in ways they could not connect to its source, a reluctance to speak up, a difficulty believing they deserved good things, a susceptibility to feeling used, to expecting that kindness must conceal a catch, formed in a childhood where kindness had concealed exactly that. They built lives over the top of it, as people do, lives that worked well enough, that held jobs and marriages and children of their own. But the thing remained underneath, unintegrated, a sealed room in the house of the self, and they lived above it without ever being able to enter it, because they did not have the key. The men had the key the whole time and never offered it. This is the part that, once seen, is hard to forgive, harder perhaps than the original deed. The men knew what had been done. The records existed. At any point across those 40 years, someone could have gone to the grown children and told them the truth, given them the knowledge that would have let them finally understand their own lives, unlock the sealed room, begin to heal. It would have cost the men something, some comfort, some standing, some admission. They did not pay it. They kept the key and let the children go on living above the sealed room year after year, in the dark about themselves, because the alternative was to disturb the flattering peace the silence had built. The silence served the men. It cost the children the truth of their own lives, and the men chose every year, by doing nothing, to let that arrangement stand. When the truth finally came then, it came not as a gift from the men, but almost against them, pried loose by accident and by the labour of others, arriving at last in the grown children from the outside, from a radio, a newspaper, a chain of strangers doing their jobs. The men had kept the key to the very end. It took the world reaching past them, around them, to put the truth at last into the hands of the people it belonged to, the people it had always belonged to, who had waited 40 years in the dark for a thing that had been available the whole time, withheld, just out of reach, on a shelf in a basement, in a box no one would open. Let that stillness hold for a moment, in the warm dark before anything stirs, the boxes on their shelves, the children grown old, carrying their unexplained wounds through ordinary lives, the men at peace with what they had done, the whole long, even silence of the middle of the century, in which a great wrong waited patient and complete for someone to find it. We are close now to the finding. We are close to the cold December morning when a reporter opens a folder and a man turns on his car radio, and the silence of 40 years finally, gently breaks. The disturbance, when it came from an unexpected direction, and not from any search for these particular children at all. In the closing years of the century, the government that had once funded so much of this research underwent a change of heart, or at least a change of policy. A new official charged with overseeing the nation's atomic affairs decided that the long-buried history of experiments involving radiation on human beings should be brought into the light. Old files were to be opened, old studies were to be acknowledged. The secrecy that had wrapped so much of the early atomic age was, in this one respect, to be loosened, and the records were to be released for the public to see. It was in part an act of conscience, and in part an act of housekeeping, a government finally totalling up an old and shameful account. But whatever its motives, the effect was to crack open the long silence. Among the many studies named in the review were the feeding experiments at the school off Trapelo Road, the ones with the radioactive traces in the oatmeal in the milk, the ones conducted on the boys of the science club. The studies that had slept in their boxes for 40 years were suddenly, for the first time, the subject of official attention. And where official attention goes, the press follows. So it was that on a winter morning, the day after the great feast of the year, a major newspaper carried the story on its front page. A reporter had found the records, had read what was in them, had understood what they meant, and had written it plainly for an ordinary reader to grasp. Children at a state institution had been fed radioactive material without being told, lured into a study with the promise of treats and outings, used as subjects in research, funded by a serial company and an agency of the government. The careful columns of data, the warm deceptive letter, the watches, the ball games, all of it laid out at last in the cold daylight of a newspaper page for the whole city and then the whole country to read. And here is the moment that gives the whole long story its human centre, the moment around which everything else turns. One of the boys, now an ageing man, was in his car that morning, the radio on, going about an ordinary errand on an ordinary day, and the news came over the radio, the report of the experiments at the school, the children fed radioactive cereal, the science club, the long-hidden study now revealed. And the man listening, the grown boy, heard the name of the place where he had spent his childhood, and heard the description of the club he had been so proud to join, and the truth arrived in him all at once, the way truth does after a lifetime of waiting. "That can't be right," he said aloud, alone in his car. And then, as the pieces fell into place, as the watch and the milk and the trips to the ball game and the special breakfast all suddenly meant something they had never meant before, the realization completed itself, and he understood, and he cried out the only words that fit. "That's me. They're talking about me." The boy from the science club, the chosen one, the special one, hearing on his car radio 40 years too late what the men had quietly mixed into the warm breakfast of his childhood. Try to feel the strangeness of that moment, the collision of two lives in a single instant. There was the child he'd been, happy and grateful, sure he had been singled out for kindness, and there was the man he had become, hearing for the first time the truth beneath that kindness, the deception folded inside the gift. The two understandings met in him at once, the old joy and the new betrayal, and they could not both be true, and yet they were. He had been chosen. He had also been used. The watch had been real. The deception had been real too. Everything he remembered was true, and the meaning of all of it had just been turned inside out on a winter morning by a voice on the radio. He was not alone. Across the region, other men, other aging boys of the science club, learned the truth in the same scattered way, from the radio, from the newspaper, from a relative who had read the story and called. Each of them carried suddenly the same double knowledge, the same overturning of a childhood memory. And among them, that man who had cried out in his car became something more than a victim. He became a gatherer. He began to find the others, to reach out, to assemble the scattered boys of the science club into a group, into a force, into something the men who had used them had never imagined these powerless children could become. A voice. This is the turning of the whole story, the place where the long silence finally breaks and cannot be sealed again. For 40 years the wrong had lain dormant because the victims had no power, and no platform, and no knowledge of what had been done to them. Now they had the knowledge. The records were open, the press was paying attention, and the children, grown old, scattered and ordinary, began to do the thing that the entire machinery of the institution and the experiment had been built, without anyone quite saying so, to prevent. They began to come together, and to speak, and to insist that the world look at what had been done to them, and call it by its true name. It is worth noticing what it took. It took an act of government, undertaken for its own reasons. It took a reporter willing to read old files and write a hard story. It took the accident of a man hearing his own childhood described on the radio. The truth did not surface because justice has some natural tendency to rise. It surfaced because a chain of particular people, most of whom had never heard of these boys, happened to do their jobs in a way that let the light in. Had any link in that chain been missing, The boxes might be sitting in their basement still, and the men might rest undisturbed in their honoured graves, and the boys of the science club might have died, every one of them, never knowing what had been done to them. The truth came out, but it came out by a hair, and by luck, and that too is part of what this story has to teach. Consider how much had to align for that winter morning to happen at all, because the precariousness of it is itself a lesson. The records had to have survived, not been thrown out in some basement clearing over 40 years. The government had to decide, for its own reasons, to open the old files on radiation research, a decision that could easily have gone another way or not been made at all. A reporter had to receive that disclosure, recognise the human story buried in the technical language, and take the trouble to dig out the particulars and write them for ordinary readers. And then, by pure chance, one of the men those records concerned had to be near a radio at the moment the story was read, and had to be listening, and had to hear the name of his own childhood spoken aloud on the air. Subtract any one of these, and the silence holds. The record's lost, and there is nothing to disclose. The disclosure never made, and the reporter has no thread to pull. The story never written for a general audience, and it stays sealed in the small world of specialists who had always known and never minded. The man not listening, and he lives out his life never learning what was done to him, like so many others who were never near a radio at the right moment and died not knowing. The truth did not rise because truth rises. It surfaced through a chain of contingent human choices, any link of which could have failed, and the fact that it surfaced at all is closer to luck than to justice. But once it surfaced, something happened that was not luck. That was the opposite of luck. That was the deliberate work of a wronged man refusing to let the moment pass. The grown boy who cried out in his car did not simply absorb the news and return to his errand. He acted. He understood, with the clarity that the truth had just given him, that there were others, dozens of others. The boys of the science club scattered now across decades and distances, most of whom did not yet know, some of whom might be near their own radios and some of whom might never hear at all. And he set out to find them, to reach them, to gather the scattered survivors into one place and one voice. This gathering is the quiet heroism at the centre of the story, and it belongs entirely to the survivors themselves. No one organised them. No institution convened them. The very thing that had made them usable as children, their isolation, their powerlessness, their lack of any advocate, was the thing the grown man now set about undoing, one phone call, one connection, one reunion at a time. He found the others. He told them what he had learned. He assembled out of men who had been taught their whole lives that they were nobody's children who did not matter, a body of people who could stand together and be heard. The boys who had been chosen, once, as ideal subjects precisely because they could be controlled and would not resist, became, in old age, people who refused to be controlled and who resisted with everything they had. There is a justice in that shape, even if it is a justice that arrived too late to be called fair. The men who designed the science club had counted on the permanent silence of their subjects, had built the whole arrangement on the assumption that institutional children would never have the power or the knowledge or the standing to call anyone to account. For 40 years that assumption held, and then it broke, not because the men had been wrong about how the world treats the powerless, but because a single survivor, handed the truth by an accident of radio, decided to spend the rest of his life proving the assumption wrong. The voice the system had been built to silence found itself at last, and once found, it would not be put away again. There is a sound a person makes alone, when a long-hidden truth arrives all at once, and the man in the car made it. That cannot be right. And then, as the pieces lock together, that is me. It is the sound of a life rearranging itself in real time, of 40 years of memory suddenly acquiring a meaning they had never had, of the watch and the milk and the ballpark all turning, in an instant, from gifts into evidence. No one prepares you for such a moment. It comes on an ordinary morning during an ordinary errand with the radio on, and it changes everything that came before it, reaching back across the decades to alter the meaning of your own childhood while you sit gripping the wheel. What he felt in that moment must have been almost too much to hold, because it was so many things at once. There was vindication of a kind. The sudden confirmation that the unease he may have carried for years had a real source, that he had not imagined it. There was horror at understanding for the first time what had actually been done to him. There was grief for the trusting boy he had been, so happy to be chosen, so grateful for the watch. And there was anger, finally. An anger he had never been able to feel before because he had never known there was anything to be angry about. An anger that now had, at last, a target. All of it arrived together, in the car, in the space of a few sentences from the radio. And then, crucially, he did not let the moment collapse him. This is the turn that makes him more than a victim. A person could be destroyed by such a revelation, could sink under the weight of it, could let the new knowledge become simply a fresh wound laid over the old one. He did something else. He converted the shock into purpose. He thought immediately of the others, the boys he had known, the friends from the wards, scattered now but real, and he understood that they too needed to know, that the truth that had just been handed to him belonged to them as well, that he could be the one to carry it to them. In the very moment of his own overturning, he became a gatherer, a finder, a voice for the others. The reunions that followed, the slow assembling of the scattered survivors, must have been extraordinary occasions, men meeting again after decades, men who had been boys together in the wards, comparing memories, fitting their separate pieces into a single picture, understanding together what none of them could fully understand alone. The watch you got, the milk, the trips, the special breakfast, each man's fragment confirming the others, the shared memory building into shared knowledge, the shared knowledge into shared resolve. They had been a kind of family in the wards decades ago, and now that family reassembled itself around a new and terrible common knowledge and around a new and common purpose, which was to make the world acknowledge what had been done to them. This is the deep reversal at the heart of the story, the thing the men who built the club could never have foreseen. They had chosen these boys precisely because they seemed safe to use, isolated, powerless, certain to remain forever silent. And the very bonds those boys had formed to survive their childhoods, the fierce friendships of the wards became, half a century later, the network through which they found one another and turned at last into a force. The family the institution had failed to give them, which they had built for themselves out of nothing, was the thing that finally let them speak. The men had counted on the boys' isolation. The boys had quietly defeated that isolation long ago. In the dark of the dormitories, and now grown old, they spent what it had given them. Let the winter morning hold for a moment. The man in his car, the radio still speaking, the world tilting under him as 40 years rearranged themselves in an instant. That can't be right. That's me. The silence is broken now. It will not close again. What follows the breaking? The hearings and the lawsuits and the slow grinding apparatus of a reckoning. We will come to gently, in its turn. But pause here first, with the grown boy and his overturned childhood, in the strange grief and stranger relief of finally, after a lifetime, knowing the truth of one's own life. A late and imperfect justice. The reckoning, when it came, was real, and it was also incomplete, and both of those things should be held together, because the truth of how these stories end is rarely as clean as we would wish. The wrong was at last acknowledged. It was named in public, examined, debated, in some measure compensated, and yet no one went to prison, and the money was modest, and many of the men responsible were beyond the reach of any judgment, and the children, now old, received an apology and a settlement and the cold comfort of finally being believed, which was a great deal, and was not nearly enough. It began with hearings. The matter was grave enough and public enough that the legislature took it up, and the men who had organised the studies, although still living, were called to account before a committee, in a room with cameras, under questioning. One senator, chairing the proceedings, pressed the point that cut to the heart of everything. He asked why, if this research was so safe and so valuable, it had not been done on the children of the comfortable, on students at the great university itself, on the sons of professors and doctors. Why had the subjects been, instead, the most vulnerable people in the society, young children locked away in an institution? Are you not appalled, he asked, that these were the ones chosen? It was the right question, the only question really, and it had no good answer, because the honest answer was the indictment itself. They had not used the children of the comfortable, because the children of the comfortable had parents who would have refused, who would have asked hard questions, who could have made trouble. They had used the institutional children precisely because those children could be controlled, and that control, the very thing that had made them good subjects, was the thing that made the choosing of them a crime. The senator's question did not need an answer. The question was the answer. To ask why the powerless had been chosen was to say everything that needed saying about the men who chose them. Alongside the hearings came the lawsuits. The grown boys of the science club, gathered now into a group by the man who had heard the truth on his radio, brought their case against the great university and the cereal company, and the others who had used them. It was a hard fight, as such fights always are, against institutions with deep resources and skilled lawyers, and every reason to minimise what had been done. But the records were there, the boxes finally opened, the warm deceptive letter with its missing word, the careful data that proved the children had been subjects without ever being told. In the end, the institution settled, agreeing to pay, and the boys of the science club received a sum of money divided among them in acknowledgement of what had been taken. The orphans from the room by the river had their reckoning too, separately and later, a lawsuit brought by the survivors of the study and by the families of those who had died. They had carried their wounds for more than 60 years, the withdrawnness, the shame, the self-doubt planted in childhood and never named. The state that had run the orphanage agreed at last to a settlement, paid to the handful of survivors and to the estates of those who had not lived to see it. After more than 6 decades, the harm done in that small plain room was finally written down in a legal document and answered with money, which is the only way our world knows how to say, formally, that a wrong occurred. And there were apologies, of a sort. The president of the great university expressed sorrow that the children and their families had not been told the truth about what the studies involved, and called the acknowledgement the decent thing to do. Task forces were convened, reports written, hundreds of pages compiled, examining what had been done and finding, in careful institutional language, that the research had violated the fundamental human rights of the subjects, that the consent obtained had been inadequate, that the children had been unfairly enticed by the gifts and privileges held out to them. The formal machinery of acknowledgement did its work. The wrong was, on paper, fully recognised at last. But weigh that recognition honestly, because the same task forces that condemned the ethics also confirmed the smallness of the physical harm, the low doses, the absence of measurable injury to the boys' bodies, and the defenders of the work seized on this, as they always had, to argue that the apology was generous, that the studies had not really hurt anyone, that the science had been sound and only the paperwork lacking. The reckoning thus arrived already half undermined, granting the wrong with one hand while shrinking it with the other. The men were sorry that consent had not been properly obtained. They were not, many of them, sorry that the studies had been done, and that distinction, fine as it sounds, is the whole distance between a true reckoning and a managed one. This is the unsatisfying shape of justice when it comes decades late to the powerless. It is real. It matters. The settlements were not nothing. The apologies were not nothing. The public naming of the wrong was not nothing. And for the aging children to be believed at last, to have the world finally agree that yes, this happened, and yes, it was wrong, was a thing of genuine weight after a lifetime of carrying it alone. But it came too late for most of them to be made whole, and it came wrapped in qualifications, and it left the deepest question, the question of why some children had ever been treated as usable in the first place, mostly unasked and entirely unanswered. The books were not balanced. They were merely closed. And yet something was won. Beyond the money and the words, something that outlasts any settlement. The studies entered the record not as triumphs but as warnings. They became, in the years that followed, the very cases taught to young doctors and scientists as the things that must never be done again, the dark mirror held up in every course on the ethics of research, the rules that now surround all experiments on human beings, the requirement of true and informed consent, the special protections for children and for anyone who cannot freely refuse, the independent committees that must weigh every study before it begins, were built in part out of exactly these wrongs. The children had been used to prove things about iron and calcium and disease. In the end, unwillingly, posthumously for many of them, they proved something far more important. They proved why the powerless must never again be treated as material. Their suffering became the foundation of the protections that now guard other children. It is a bitter kind of legacy, one at a price they never agreed to pay. But it is a real one, and it is theirs. The hearings did something that the settlements alone could not do. They placed the wrong on the public record in the open, with the cameras running and the questions asked aloud, so that it could never again be a private matter, quietly settled among professionals. When the senator asked why the most vulnerable had been chosen, he was not only questioning the men in the room, he was establishing for the country and for the future that this was the question, that the choosing of the powerless was the heart of the offence, that no appeal to small doses or sound method or valuable findings could answer it. The hearing turned a buried technical matter into a public moral one, and that turning was itself a form of justice, distinct from any check that was ever written. It matters too that the survivors testified, that they sat in those rooms and told what had been done to them, in their own voices, as grown men and women rather than as the controlled subjects they had once been. For people who had spent their childhoods being unable to refuse, unable to question, unable to be believed, the simple act of speaking and being heard, on the record, by people with the power to act, was a reversal of everything the institutions had taught them about their place in the world. They had been objects of study. Now they were witnesses, agents, persons with standing. The hearing did not undo their childhoods, but it let them stand, at last, in the posture the institutions had denied them, upright and speaking and listened to. The settlements, weighed coldly, were modest, and it is right to say so plainly rather than to dress the ending in more satisfaction than it earned. A sum of money divided among aging survivors does not equal a stolen childhood, and everyone involved knew it. The money was an acknowledgement, a formal admission that a wrong had occurred, and that the institutions responsible owed something for it. An acknowledgement has real value, but it is not restoration, and nothing in this story was ever restored. The children who were harmed permanently. The years they lost not knowing were lost permanently. No settlement reaches back into a childhood and mends it. The most that money can do is say, in the only language our institutions fully speak, that the debt is recognised, and the recognition, while it matters, is not the same as repayment. What outlasted the money, and what may in the end matter most, was the way these cases reshaped the rules that govern all research on human beings. The reckoning did not stay confined to the particular institutions and the particular survivors. It fed into a broad reconsideration of how science may and may not treat the people it studies, a reconsideration that hardened into requirements with real teeth, the demand that subjects be genuinely informed and genuinely free to refuse, the special and heightened protections owed to children, to the institutionalized, to anyone whose circumstances make free refusal difficult. The requirement that independent committees, answerable to no single researcher's ambition, weigh every proposed study before it may begin. These protections did not exist in any enforceable form when the children of this story were used. They exist now in part because of what was done to them. So the children, who were used to settle a question about cereal and to chart the course of a disease, ended by settling a far larger question that no one had asked them to settle, the question of where the line must be drawn around the use of the powerless. Their suffering became the case study, the cautionary example, the thing taught to every new generation of doctors and scientists as the error that must never be repeated. It is a strange and bitter form of immortality, to be remembered not for who you were, but for what was done to you, and to have your harm become the foundation of other children's safety. The survivors did not choose that role. It was forced on them, as everything had been forced on them. But they grew into it in the end, with a dignity the men who used them never imagined they possessed, and the protections that now stand guard over the vulnerable stand in part as their monument. There is a temptation, looking at the modest settlements and the qualified apologies, to call the whole reckoning a failure, and it is worth resisting that temptation, not because the reckoning was complete, but because calling it a failure would dishonour what the survivors actually achieved. They did not get full justice because full justice was not available, because no power on earth can reach back into a childhood and restore what was taken. But they got something, and the something was hard-won and real, and it was more than the men who used them ever imagined they could get. They got the truth established on the public record, they got the wrong named in the open, they got an acknowledgement, formal and unmistakable, that what had been done to them was wrong. For people who had been told their whole lives that they did not matter, to compel the powerful to admit a wrong done to them is no small thing. And they got, perhaps most importantly, the transformation of their suffering into protection for others. This was not their intention, at least not at first. They sought acknowledgement for themselves, recognition of their own particular wrong. But the effect of their fight reached far beyond their own case, fed into the broad strengthening of the rules that now govern all research on human beings, helped to build the very protections that would prevent other children from being used as they had been used. Their case became a landmark, a thing taught, a reason. The boys who had been chosen because they were powerless ended by changing the rules that protect the powerless, and that is a victory of a strange and elevated kind, one at a cost they never agreed to but redeemed, partly by what it came to mean. Weigh, too, the simple fact of being believed, because to those who had carried the wrong in silence, it was perhaps the heaviest thing on the scale. For decades the survivors had had no one to tell, no one who would credit such a story, no framework in which the thing that had happened to them could even be heard. And then, in the hearings and the lawsuits and the press, they were heard and believed, and the world agreed with them. The thing they had carried alone became a thing the society acknowledged. The private burden became a public fact. There is a particular relief in that, distinct from any money, the relief of finally being believed about the central wound of your life, and the survivors earned that relief, and it was real, and it mattered. It would be dishonest, though, to end on relief alone, because the reckoning also left things permanently unmended, and honesty requires naming them. Many of the survivors were old by the time the truth came out, and some had already died, never knowing, never believed, never acknowledged. For them there was no reckoning at all, only a wrong carried in silence to the grave. And even for those who lived to see it, the acknowledgement came after lifetimes already shaped by the harm, too late to give them back the childhoods or the confidence or the years of not knowing. The reckoning was real, and it was also too late, and both of these are true, and the second does not cancel the first, but it does temper it, and the tempering is part of the honest shape of how these stories end. So we hold the reckoning as it actually was, neither a triumph nor a failure, but something more complicated and more human, a partial justice arriving too late, real in what it achieved and limited in what it could not reach. The survivors compelled the truth, won acknowledgement, helped protect the children who came after, and were finally believed, and all of that is genuine and hard-won and worthy of respect. And still, the wrong was never undone, because wrongs of this kind cannot be undone, only named, only acknowledged, only learned from. That is the most that was available, and the survivors wrested all of it, from a world that had given them nothing, and in doing so they turned themselves, at the very end, from the used into the vindicated, which is not everything, but is very far from nothing. Let the hearing room empty now, the cameras dark, the lawyers gone home, the settlements signed and filed. The reckoning is over, such as it was, real and partial and late. The men who could be reached have been reached. The words that could be said have been said. And the aging children, believed at last, carry away from it whatever peace a late and imperfect justice can give. We have one chapter left, the quietest of all, in which we sit with what remains when the lawsuits are settled, and the headlines fade, and ask what it means to remember these children, and how to hold their story without letting it harden into either rage or despair. What remains, when the headlines have faded and the settlements are spent and the last of the men who did these things have gone into the ground, is the children. Not the data, which was always beside the point, and not the institutions, which have mostly been torn down or emptied out, their long brick corridors fallen silent at last. What remains is the children themselves, or the memory of them, the boys at their breakfast and the girl at her small table, and the simple fact that they were here, that they lived, that they mattered, whatever the world around them decided. It would be easy to let a story like this curdle into rage, and rage would not be wrong exactly. There is much here to be angry about. But rage, held too long, becomes its own kind of darkness, and it tends, in the end, to be about the people who did the harm rather than the people who suffered it. The men, their confidence, their justifications, their machinery of excuse can come to fill the whole frame, and the children, who are the only ones who truly matter, can slip out of view behind them. So set the rage down, gently, having felt it. Let the men recede, and let the children come forward into the light where they belong. Think of them not as victims first, but as children first, which is what they were. The boy who put his hand up for the science club was a child who wanted, as every child wants, to be chosen, to be special, to be loved. That want was not foolish. It was not weakness. It was the most human thing about him, the same want that lives in every child who has ever waited to be picked, and it was beautiful, and it should have been answered with real love, and was answered instead with a watch and a deception. The wrong done to him was a wrong done to that beautiful want. They took the truest thing in him and used it as a handle. That is what we are remembering when we remember him, not a statistic, a child who hoped. And the girl by the river, who wanted the kind young woman to be her mother. Think of the size of that hope in so small a person, the hope that this once someone might stay, might claim her, might be hers. That hope was the door through which the harm walked in. And the cruelty of it was not only that the harm walked in, but that it walked in wearing the very face the hope had longed for, the gentle face, the kind voice, the attention she had wanted her whole short life. To be hurt is terrible. To be hurt by the thing you hoped would save you is a wound of a different order. That is what she carried, unnamed, for 60 years. That is what we hold when we hold her memory. Not a case, a girl who wanted a mother. There is a temptation, looking back from the safety of a later age, to feel superior to the people of this story, to imagine that we would have known better, that we would have refused, that such things could never involve people like us. Resist that temptation, because it is the very door through which the harm first entered. The men who did these things believed they were good. They believed they were on the side of progress. They believed the rules that bound lesser people did not quite bind them, because their purposes were so important. Every age has its version of that belief, its own bright certainty that justifies its own quiet cruelties, its own way of deciding that some lives count less. The lesson of this story is not that those people were uniquely wicked. It is that ordinary, intelligent, well-meaning people, sure they are doing good, are entirely capable of grave harm, and that the surest sign of danger is the feeling that one's cause is too important for the ordinary rules to apply. So the children leave us with a warning, but it is a quiet warning, not a shrill one. Be careful of any system that sorts human beings into those who must be protected and those who may be used. Be careful of the powerful certainty that some great goal justifies a small harm to the helpless. Be careful above all of the comfortable distance from which cruelty always looks like reason, the distance of the well-meaning observer who sees the beautiful building and the fed children and the important science, and does not see, because he is not looking, the deception folded quietly inside it. The harm in this story was never done by people who thought of themselves as cruel. That is the whole of the warning. That is what the children paid to teach us. And they leave us too with something gentler than a warning, something closer to grace. Because in the end the truth did come out, late and partial and imperfect, but it came. The boxes were opened. The reporter read the files. The man heard his childhood on the radio and cried out and gathered the others, and the world was made at last to look and to listen, and to call the wrong by its true name. The powerless found a voice. The forgotten were remembered. It took 40 years, and 60, and it was far too late for far too many, and still it happened, which means it can happen, which means that no wrong is ever so deeply buried that it cannot, by the patient work of decent people, be brought back into the light. That is not nothing. On a long night, holding a hard story, it is something to rest on. So let us leave the children where they would want to be left, not in the wards, not at the small table, not in the moment of their harm, but free of all of it. Let the boy out through the gates at last into the green afternoon he was promised, the real one, the one with nothing hidden in it, and let him run across the grass toward the open day. Let the girl by the river have the mother she wanted, in whatever country the imagination keeps for the mending of old wounds. Let them be only children again, chosen and safe and truly loved, which is all they ever asked, and all they were ever owed, and the one thing the world, in its certainty and its hurry, forgot to give them. There is a question that hovers over a story like this, and it deserves a gentle and honest answer before the night closes. The question is what we are meant to do with it, now that we know. It would be possible to take from it only despair, to conclude that the world is cruel and the powerful prey on the weak and nothing can be done. But that conclusion, though it feels like wisdom, is a kind of laziness, and it is not what the children's story actually teaches. The story does not end in the wards. It ends with the truth coming out, with the survivors gathering, with the rules being rewritten, with a society slowly learning to protect what it had once used. The arc is long, and it is grim in its middle, but it bends in the end toward the light, and that bending was the work of human hands. What the story asks of us is not despair, but attention, a particular and ongoing attention to the places in our own world where the powerless are gathered and the comfortable look away. Every age has such places. Every society draws its line between the children who count and the children who do not, and every society is tempted to make use of those it has placed on the wrong side of the line. The specific institutions of this story are mostly gone, the long brick corridors emptied, the practices outlawed. But the deeper pattern, the temptation to treat some human beings as available for the purposes of others, is not gone, and will not be gone, and requires in every generation the same vigilance that finally too late exposed these wrongs. And so the most fitting way to honour the children is not to weep for them, though weeping is not wrong, but to carry forward the attention their story demands, to notice who, in our own time, has been placed beyond the reach of ordinary protection, to distrust the bright certainties that justify small cruelties in the name of large goods, to remember that the warmest letter can hide the coldest omission, that the most respectable institution can house the quietest wrong, that the people who do harm are rarely the people who look like villains and are usually the people who are sure they are doing good. The children paid for these lessons with their childhoods. The least we can do is learn them. But tonight is not, in the end, a night for lessons, or not only for lessons. It is a night for rest, and for the simple act of remembering, which is itself a kind of justice for those who are forgotten. To hold these children in mind, even for the length of a single quiet night, even as you drift towards sleep, is to refuse the final victory of the silence that hid them. They were real. They lived. They wanted what every child wants, to be chosen and kept and loved, and the world failed them, and the world eventually partly made it right. And now you have heard their story, and so they are remembered, by you, here in the warm dark, which is a small thing and not nothing. Let that be enough for tonight. The children are at rest. The truth is out and will not be put back. The rules now guard others in their name. There is nothing more that this night requires of you. No verdict to reach, no action to take, only the gentle holding of these small lives in your thoughts as the holding loosens and the thoughts grow soft. They wanted to be remembered, those children, the way all of us want to be remembered, the way every forgotten person has always wanted simply to have mattered to someone. And tonight, for a little while in the quiet, they have. If you find, as the story closes, that it has left a weight in you, that is not a thing to be alarmed by. It is the proper response to having looked, honestly, at a real wrong done to real children. We are right to feel it. But there is a way of carrying such a weight that is healthy and a way that is not, and the difference is worth knowing as you drift towards sleep. The unhealthy way is to let it become despair, a settled conviction that the world is only cruelty and nothing can be done. The healthy way is to let it become a quiet and durable resolve, a sharpened attention, a refusal to look away from the vulnerable in one's own time. The weight is the same. What you make of it is the choice. And there is real ground for the healthier choice, not as consolation, but as fact. The story does not end where the harm ends. It ends where the truth comes out, where the survivors are believed, where the rules are rewritten so that other children are spared. That ending was not inevitable. It was made by particular people doing particular work, refusing to let a buried wrong stay buried, which means that the bending of things toward the light, slow and late and incomplete as it was, is something human beings can do, have done, will do again. The same world that produced the wrong also produced the people who exposed it, and the protections that now stand guard, and the very telling of this story tonight. Darkness is real, so is the lifting of it. Both are true, and the second is no less true than the first. The children themselves would not, I think, want to be remembered only as victims, only as a wound, only as an occasion for grief. No one wants that. They were whole people, or would have been allowed to become whole people in a kinder world, children with jokes and friendships and small joys and large hopes. The boy thrilled by the watch on his wrist, the girl hoping the kind young woman might stay. To remember them rightly is to remember the wholeness, not just the harm, to hold them as the children they were rather than only as the subjects they were made into. The wrong was done to whole children, and it is the wholeness, even more than the wrong, that deserves to be kept. So as the night closes, let the holding of them be gentle, and let it be whole. Picture them not in the small room or the ward or the moment of their using, but freed, finished with all of it, the boy running out at last into the green afternoon with nothing hidden in it, the girl somewhere warm and claimed and safe. They asked for so little, those children, only the thing every child asks for, to be wanted and kept and loved. The world, in its certainty and its hurry, failed to give it. But you have heard their story now and held them, even for the space of a single night, and in that holding they are, for a little while, exactly what they always wanted to be, which is remembered and mattered to, and not alone. There is nothing more the night requires. The children are at rest. The truth is out and will not be put back. The rules now guard others in their name, and the wrong, though it can never be undone, has been seen and named and learned from, which is the most that the living can offer the wronged. Let the weight settle now into something quiet, something almost peaceful, the settled peace of a hard thing fully felt and gently held. The institutions are empty, the corridors are silent, and somewhere beyond all of it, in the country the heart keeps for the mending of old wounds, the children are running in the long gold light, free at last, and chosen, and finally wholly at home. The institutions are quiet now. The long brick corridors are empty. The boxes have been opened and read, and the children have been believed, and the men have been answered, as far as they ever will be. There is nothing left to do tonight but remember, gently, and let the remembering settle into something like peace. The harm is finished. The children are at rest, and the truth, which waited so long in its boxes, is out now, and will not be put back, and stands as their memorial, plain and permanent, in the open air at last. Thank you for staying with this story to the end, and for letting these children be remembered. If these quiet histories help you find your way down into sleep, a like and a subscription help more of them get made, and they will be here whenever you need them. For now, though, there is nothing left to do but rest. So let the story loosen now, and let it go. We are back where we began, in the long brick building on the edge of the town, in the middle of the winter night. The radiator is ticking in the dark. The same slow and kindly sound. The heat rising through the old iron pipes the way it has risen every winter for 50 years. Outside, the snow has settled on the fields, pale and unmoving under a sky the colour of slate. And inside, in the dormitory near the end of the hall, the children are sleeping in their narrow beds, safe now, finished with all of it, at rest. There is nothing more to know tonight. The boxes are opened. The truth is out. The children have been remembered and believed, and the long silence has been answered, as far as it ever will be. You can set the whole weight of it down now. You do not have to carry it. The harm is finished, and the remembering is done, and all that is left is the warm dark and the ticking of the radiator, and the soft, even tide of sleeping breath. Let your own breathing slow to match it. In and out. In and out. The way the boys breathe in the dormitory, the way the snow lies still on the fields, the way the heat rises gently through the pipes and fills the warm room and asks nothing of anyone. There is nowhere you need to be. There is nothing you need to do. The story has told itself, and it is over, and you are here, wherever you are, warm and safe and growing heavy. Feel the bed beneath you, holding all your weight, the way the old building held the sleeping children through so many quiet nights. Feel the dark settle softly over the room. Let the last images blur and fade, the brick corridors, the tall clean windows, the grey line of children crossing the grass in the long gold light. Let them grow soft and softer, and let them dissolve entirely into the warm and even dark. The radiator ticks, the snow holds its silence, the children sleep, and you are drifting now, slow and untroubled, down past the last of the words, down into the deep still water, where there are no stories at all, only rest, only quiet, only the long soft breath of the winter night carrying you gently, gently, all the way down into sleep. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is for you. I am always curious about that. And if you have a topic you would like to drift off to next, leave it in the comments, and it may become the story that carries you down some other quiet night.